Oh, hello world. Welcome to Comic Book News. It's me, your old pal Dan Shaheen. Holy moly. I got another great guest. It's just been great guest after great guest. What a Socceroony lineup I've had lately. Before we get to today's guest, Steve Bissette, a little bit of show business. You know, my analytics tell me that most of you watching this are not subscribed. I know. Like, that's the kind of hooks I got into you, right? Like, I know what's going on. You're not subscribed. You watch this thing, but you've never bothered to click that button. I'm going to ask you, please, do me a favor. Click it. If you want to see more interviews like this, maybe hit that little bell thing for notifications when new videos drop, and then you can watch them live. Because this show is live. I don't pre-record and edit this stuff. I bring the real deal in here live, and we talk unfiltered one-on-one. So thank you for tuning in to today's chat. If you've got comics that you want to see here on this show, there's one place that you can send them. To the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. Beautiful Arcata, California. It's sunny, sometimes Humboldt County. It's not sunny today. It's a little overcast and cloudy. Good comics reading weather and good comics talking weather. I've already been talking with today's guest for 20 minutes in the green room, the virtual green room. And man, so many things that we talked about already. I know that this is going to be a fun conversation. First, a little bit more show business. Coming up next week, we've got, I don't know if any of you guys watching this have ever heard of this guy, Jim Rugg. Oh man, the incredible Jim Rugg. He makes his third return to this show to talk about Incredible Hulk Grand Design. You know what those are. You know who he is. We don't have to worry about him. That's going to be fun. And I just booked, coming up a little bit later in February, you might have heard of this guy, Paul Levitz. Man, maybe we could talk to today's guest about him a little bit too, see if he's got any juicy tidbits on Paul. But before we do, before we talk to Steve, let's go take a look. Wait a minute, where are we going to take a look? You know where?
To the bat poles.
Yeah, that's right. We're in the Bat Cave. Drunken Sailor says hi. Hi, Drunken Sailor. You could put questions for today's guest in the chat. I may or may not ask them during the show, but if you wait till the end during the Q&A period, I'll definitely ask it. So if you've got burning questions for Steve Bissette, bring them on. If you want somebody to ask more questions about stuff than when's Tyrant gonna return, then please throw that in there, because I'm just gonna hammer him with Tyrant questions the whole show. No, I'm just kidding. I will beat that dead dinosaur a little bit, and we'll talk about Tyrant. We'll talk about 1963. We'll talk about Swamp Thing. We'll talk about all the great stuff he's working on going forward. His career teaching. He's working in the Blu-ray industry these days. He's got a lot to say and a lot to show and a lot to share about that. So what am I doing jawboning with you? Let's bring him in right now. Welcome to Comic Book News, Steve Bissette. Hi, Steve.
Hi, I'm not hearing you though, Dan.
Oh my gosh, have I been silent the entire time? You don't hear me at all? What about you out there in TV land? Do you hear me? Please put something in the comments, because if you don't hear me all of a sudden, I'm really bummed. You don't hear me at all, Steve. Still not here. Okay, wow, we're having a problem here then. Guys, I'm not really sure what to say here. What do we got in the comments? I hear you fine, Steve. I think this is on your side. And John, he can hear both of us. Mind blower. So I think, Steve, this might be volume on your side or something.
I got it. Okay, sorry. You can cut all that. I hear you now.
Yeah, all right.
Sorry about that.
Oh, man, that's
Apologies. Hi, everybody. Welcome.
we had
Thanks.
we had the
Thanks for
longest
having me.
tech check ever before this thing. And
Yeah,
now
it was working fine. I don't know why the volume just dropped at some point. Anyway, we're here. So
okay.
I've
Steve,
never
so
been in
what-
the Batcave before.
That surprises me. You've worked for every comic book company. Did you ever draw Batman for DC?
I wrote a Batman. It was actually a Swamp Thing annual, and I wrote a crossover with Batman involving an infectious fungus. And at the time, I remember my friend Dave Sims saying, "Well, I knew you were on your way out, and everybody always does one Batman story before they leave DC." So, but I didn't draw it. Somebody else did. Tom Mandrake, one of my old Kubert school buddies, did the artwork for the annual, I believe. And so I didn't get to draw the Batcave. I did do a sketch for somebody once of the giant penny and the T-Rex in the Batcave. I guess that counts as a sketch.
Oh,
So.
the giant penny. You know, one of the things that I always thought was missing from the Batman TV show. So luckily, wait a minute, we figured
Can't have
out
a giant penny on the TV show, you know? That
Why
would look-
not?
It would
Why
look.
not?
It was. Oh, there we go. There's the penny. Where's the T-Rex? Where's the T-Rex?
I've got one with that too. We'll bring it in a future
Okay,
show.
far more important. Time it correctly. So
All right, Steve, you brought up the Kubert School. So let's go
Oh, yeah.
all the way back there for a second. You were, if I'm not mistaken, you were in the very first graduating class of,
yeah,
of the
yeah.
Kubert School.
That was September of 1976 until spring of 1978, and yeah, I was a member of the first ever class. It was a huge experiment, and that's where I met since then lifelong friends like Rick Veitch and Tom Yates, Ron Zalmi, John Toddleben, Tom Mandrake, Jan Dursema, Ron Randall, on and on and on. And yeah, it was an amazing experience, but it was an experiment. Like nobody knew what this was going to be or if it was going to work, including Joe and Muriel Kubert themselves.
But didn't having a name like Joe, like who is more respected at that, like he's not just some schmo who went to become because he couldn't do the job.
There's a reason we were at that. There's a reason we were at that school, and Joe Kubert was the reason we those of us who were there because of Joe.
A lot of talk about Jack Kirby, who is great. Not enough talk about Joe Kubert as even just as a cartoonist, a composer, a cover. I think he was better than Kirby as a cover artist.
Joe's one of the masters. I mean, Joe's one of the masters, and like he was of the same generation of Jack Kirby, and like Kirby and many in their generation, Joe started when he was a preteen teenager, sweeping the floor at one of the studios back in the golden age, and then was drawing Hawkman before he was done during the golden age. So yeah, Joe goes back.
I'm sorry I don't have a Joe Kubert over. I just realized that's
I saw the Jack Kirby drawing board you put up. That was appropriate. So
I got everybody. I don't have a good Joe Kubert picture. I don't even know what he looks like. As I would recognize so many of these other guys. What was he like as a person? Did you take direct instruction?
Oh yeah. Joe became like a second father. Seriously. When I went to the Kubert School, I was 21, and I had fought all my life with my father over what I wanted to do because it made no sense. I grew up in a military family, blue collar worker family, and what I wanted to do made absolutely no sense to my father. And we fought all my life until the nanosecond that my dad met Joe Kubert, and everything changed for the better at that second. Because Joe, as I said, military family. Joe was a man's man. His handshake was crippling. He had been in the service. He had a huge family. Everything about Joe demonstrated to my dad that what I wanted to do was not only okay, but that this was something that men did. This was something
Wow.
that, and I don't have that patriarchal mindset, but my father did. And meeting Joe, at the second they shook hands, the struggle with my father ended.
Okay, so what's the biggest takeaway? I could talk about the school forever, to be
Sure,
honest.
sure.
I'm really interested. But what's the biggest takeaway that when you graduated from there, that you say I got from that education that I couldn't have got anywhere else, working professionally or anything? Or was there a moment like that?
Oh, there were two things that were huge takeaways. One of them was it was a trade school. And after 2 years, we had learned the trade. I was already, so point number one, the Kubert School, as it existed at that time, was a trade school. And by the time I and my classmates graduated, we had learned the trade as it existed in 1978, right? Because the industry, the trade has changed enormously, generationally since then. But we were trained and ready. The second takeaway was I had found my tribe, right? I had found not just friendships, bonds for the rest of my adult life. I had found my tribe. I had found the people I had been looking for all 21 years. and there they were. I had been with them for 2 years, and I would be with them for the rest of my life.
Wow.
And that was probably the strongest takeaway. And that's the takeaway I offered my own students from day one in the classroom with my students at the Center for Cartoon Studies. Is
I think that's the number. Yeah, sorry.
I would say to them, this is your tribe. You know, whatever the nature of the friendships you do or don't make in this group of people, this is your tribe.
Yeah.
So, you know, and those were the two big takeaways.
I think that's the biggest thing anybody gets out of any college education, to be honest, is that experience. Because you can learn things on your own, especially these days. And it was actually that feeling of tribe. Like when I graduated, I was in broadcasting. And I hung out with all these TV guys and I knew all this stuff, but I was like, it didn't really speak to my soul. And it wasn't until I discovered computer programming and discovered that tribe that I was like, oh, it's more about the people that you're around and fitting in with those people or like wanting to be like them, I guess.
Well, it was a different tribe for me. I had already gone to Johnson State College in northern Vermont for 2 years.
Yeah, yes.
And I still have lasting friendships from the bonds I forged with people there, including some that I've outlived at this point in being in my mid-60s. But the tribal aspect of being at Kubert School was different because all of us were there just, and pardon my French, we were there just to eat, drink, sleep, and shit comics. That's all it was about. It was like this monastic experience, right? Where it was that intense for the 2 years. And I see that reflected at the Center for Cartoon Studies, where I was on the other end of the classroom as a teacher, where, you know, there were certain groups of students. It was also a 2-year program at CCS that I was teaching, much like Kubert School when I was going there as a student. But those 2 years, for certain groups of people, that becomes like this, you know, and it does have this almost monk-like or, you know, get thee to a nunnery existence because all you have time to focus on is the comics work. And that was different than the tribal bonding I experienced on a personal level at Johnson State College. My problem at Johnson was I couldn't find my tribe. I couldn't find, you know, I had a couple of classmates that were into comics, but it wasn't the be all and end all. Whereas at the Kubert School, that was it. We were all there for the same thing. And that's why it was a different. I agree with you that college can often be that experience for people, but I also know a lot of people, young and older, who didn't find that in college. In fact, they didn't find it until they went on to a later phase of life, you know.
I think it's an opportunity to know if that is your tribe or not.
Right.
Like, if you get into pre-med school and you're like, there's all these type A assholes around me that it's just like a pressure cooker, and like, you're not cut out to be a doctor. I'm sorry if you can't handle those people, right? And you're hanging out with the art students. Well, I don't know. That's what I think the biggest experience from college is just now the price, the cost to get that experience.
I was able to pay for 3 years of college out of my savings, and it wasn't until I didn't know if I was going to be able to go the second year at Kubert School. It's one of the reasons that by the time we were moving into the spring semester, meaning January of my first year at Kubert School, I was already carving out a day every 2 weeks to go into the city looking for work, because I didn't know if I was going to be able to stay in New Jersey and do the second year. But the cost was such that my parents, they could see I was serious. And my dad said, we'll pay for it. They paid for the second year at Kubert School. But college was affordable enough that I was able to pay out of my savings from working, from the age of 6 until the end of my teens, working for the family store and a couple of other jobs. I could pay for my college, and that's not possible anymore.
Yeah, those days are done. Those days are done.
But then again, when I moved back to Vermont after a year and a half after graduating Kubert School, I was able to find a one-room brick schoolhouse with a $65 a month rent, and that's not possible anymore either.
There you go.
I don't think you could get a bathroom tub for $65 a month anywhere in America right now as a rental.
That's one of the few advantages I think of being of an older generation is you're not just crippled with debt out of the gate.
I had no running water or electricity. Let's not romanticize it too much.
Okay. Well, so you made it through those years. You did your work. You got you had your fallback degree from Johnson, and then you came
it wasn't
and got
a degree. I never had a degree. So,
okay.
No, I went 2 years, but.
And you did your school, and you made your parents proud enough that they were willing to pay for this thing. They saw that you were on a serious track. This was not just some flight of fancy. This is something
I
you
was
were gonna
dead serious. Right.
Okay, so out of the gate, what comics do you start drawing? What's your first professional?
Well, the first professional work that many of us did were work programs that Joe and Muriel had set up at the school. So, Rick Veach, Tom Yates, Kara Sherman Torino, Ron Zalmi, Rick Taylor, a lot of my first year classmates, we worked on those Heroes World catalogs.
Yeah.
Heroes World, had those mail order comic book format catalogs with all the.
Oh my gosh!
We physically put those things together, and we were either repasting up old photostats from ads that Heroes World had placed in Marvel Comics, or we were drawing from scratch images of those products. So that was our first. And then, that was we also did paste up and mechanicals on the New American Library standard size paperback collections of like Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. So we were taking photostats that Joe brought in from DC Comics of the original comic art pages from Golden Age and Silver Age stories. And our job was to follow the templates that Joe had prescribed of how to break those pages up and reformat them for a small paperback size.
Yeah.
And in one way, it was Dross work, drone work. But in another way, we were learning a lot of the rudiments of storytelling because we had to dismantle and reintegrate, these pieces of comic art. And some of them were wonderful, Dick Sprang, Batman pages and so on. Others were not so wonderful. But they all told the story in their original form, and we had to make sure we didn't lose that in turning a full comic size page into like a 3-panel page or a 2-panel page and maintaining the flow. And then
that's really right in the nuts and bolts of the panel to panel storytelling and turning a page, what is supposed to be a single page into multiple pages. You have decisions to make, not big ones maybe, but
they were big ones. Joe was teaching us, look, you've still got to lead the eye from left to right. We sometimes would have to flop an image because in repasting the page, you're changing the flow of action, and to make it work, you're taking what was 1 page and it might now be 3 pages. And so we were learning a great deal. That was a very instructional job in and of itself. And then we also had, some of us had the opportunity to do 1 to 6 page backup material for Sergeant Rock, which was the comic book that Joe Kubert
Whoa.
was still editing.
Yeah.
And, it was everything from 1 page humor pages, GI humor pages, or 1 to 2 page battle albums, where you would bring in some sort of factoid from the history of war.
Yeah.
And if Joe approved it and you worked up a design, that became a 1 or a double page spread battle album. And best
That
of all
kind of
worlds,
work doesn't even exist anymore, like
well,
those
that's
type
it.
of pages. And
That's it.
that's
Best
sad.
of all worlds, though, was you sold Joe a story, or Joe assigned you a script. Rick Veach and I, the first thing we jammed on that wasn't just for fun. I mean, Rick and I, we hit it off really quickly. First day at Kubert School, we hit it off, and we were jamming on our own stuff after hours. But the first professional work we jammed on was a war story for Sergeant Rock, a Vietnam War story called A Song for Saigon Sally. And it was a script by Val Eads, Eads. And it's crude. I mean, I look back at that and I wince, but it was our first gig and we passed muster. It saw print. So Joe cracked the whip and worked us through it. And then after that, it was open field. Rick, and I believe Rick Veach did more backup stories than anybody from the Kubert School circle. I could be wrong, but I think that's the case. And I did a fair number. My relationship with Joe was very different. Joe really worked Rick. Joe really, Joe and Rick had a real mentor apprentice relationship. Whereas mine was a bit more loosey goosey. Maybe it's because I'm more of a I don't know, a fuckhead. or I wasn't, I wasn't going to be hammered into shape. I was irredeemable in that way. But I sold Joe a script that Tom Yates drew called Live by the Sword, Die by the Sword. I got to solo draw Pencils and Inks, Bob Kanigher script. I got to the dream was to sell Joe a script you were going to draw. That's what we were all shooting for, and I got to do a couple of those. So to answer your question, what I really wanted to do was horror comics, but there were no horror comics at that time. So I would satisfy my hunger by convincing Joe that this script I had brought in called Crabs was enough of a war story that I could get away with it. Let's see. There's a question. What were you and Rick jamming on? We started by doing like illustrations. Like we would often just tape 2 pieces of Bristol board together and do like an imaginary double page spread. And that was something Rick and I continued doing even after we graduated Kubert School. In fact, the story we did that was published in Epic Illustrated #2, Monkey See, that started as just a double page spread of our fantasy of what sea monkeys should have looked like. Those mail order sea monkeys that you would order from the back of the comic, and they were like little microscopic brine shrimp when you actually put them in water. They were so not what was in the ad. And Rick and I did like this painting of real what we pictured sea monkeys as, these giant elephantine flippered primates, And
the world wants to see that, Steve.
Well,
if that
and
still exists.
We shopped it around, and John Workman, the art director at Heavy Metal, loved the piece, and said, if you guys can work up a story, we'll buy this. But the story we worked up didn't satisfy Heavy Metal. So we tried another approach, and the story we worked up ended up being purchased by Rick Marshall, who was the editor at Marvel, who started Epic Illustrated. So it was in the flat files when Archie Goodwin took over Epic Illustrated. And that was our foot in the door. So Rick and I were jamming on all kinds of stuff to answer the question. I did the same with John Totleben. When we graduated Kubert School, Rick Veach, John Talbot, myself, and Tom Yates went in together on the rent for a house, so we could stay in walking distance of the Kubert School and Joe Kubert. And so we jammed on a lot of stuff. A lot of what we jammed on was just for fun when we were between gigs. A lot of what we jammed on were deadline jobs where we'd help each other make the deadline if we needed that help, and I needed that kind of help fairly regularly. So we jammed on everything. You know,
Awesome.
we were all for one for all.
Okay, tell me, I don't know when in continuity or in your career continuity. Oops, let me bring it over here.
Oh,
Sorry.
Death Rattle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Because
was later on.
this is one of my favorite least talked about underground comics for
I
sure.
love Death
Death
Rattle.
Rattle was
I was so proud to be part of
fantastic.
it. Yeah.
And
I
I almost forgot about it till recently because it doesn't get the play of even like a slow death.
Well, Skull and let's talk about the underground comics. That's what made
Yeah.
me want to be a cartoonist. Was Skull Comics. In fact, what made me want to be a cartoonist, and this is relevant to the Death Rattle cover and story that you've just mentioned, Dan. Um, Tom Veitch was my favorite underground comics writer, and this is long before I'd met Rick, and certainly long before I ever met his older brother Tom. It was Skull that made me want to draw comics. Specifically, it was Skull number 6, A Gothic Tale, which was a 2-part single issue story, both parts scripted by Tom Veitch. Part 1 was drawn by the late great Greg Irons. Part 2 drawn by the sadly late, always great Richard Corbin. And that comic freaked me out on such a visceral level that I dropped it. I threw it on the ground. I turned the page, and it so freaked me out. I threw it out of my hands. And the minute I did that, I thought, I want to do this to people. Like, this is what I want to do with comics. And so, years later, getting to contribute to the second iteration of Death Rattle, yeah, that's the cover of A Gothic Tale, Skull number 6. Um, and, around that same time is when I read Two Fisted Zombies. And it was Two Fisted Zombies that made me believe I could maybe make a go of it in comics. And I've said this to Rick many times over the years. I'm not sure where I got the information that he and Tom were from Bellows Falls, Vermont, but that's what cinched it, Dan. It's like, oh, if these guys from Bellows Falls can do it, I was from Duxbury, Vermont. I could do it, right? I knew where Bellows Falls was. I knew what kind of town it was. And if they could get into comics, then there was a hope in hell I might be able to get my foot in the door. I couldn't have done it without the Kubert School. But
Okay. What
and
quick shout out. Yeah, sorry.
Death Rattle came about because I wanted to work with Tom Veitch. Once I met Rick's brother Tom, we connected, and Tom wanted me to draw something he'd written, and I wanted to draw something Tom had written. And that Death Rattle issue that you showed with our story Roadkill was my shot at working with Tom, and it was a great story, I thought.
So Ron Turner,
Right.
great comics publisher, or the greatest comics publisher?
I shy away from greatest on anything because it depends what day of the week and what I'm looking at. Okay. Ron Turner's pretty amazing, but let's face it, would Last Gasp have existed if there hadn't been a ripoff press? Would Last Gasp have existed if there hadn't been, uh, you know, uh, the earlier, shorter-lived underground comic publishers that were out there?
He would
Um,
say no. I think Ron would say no to that.
well, Ron would say no, but to me, the gift of the undergrounds for my generation is immeasurable because it was the undergrounds that tore the blinders off that I had been wearing all my life, not knowing I was wearing. I thought comics could only be this. And as soon as my high school art teacher, Bill Cathy, handed me Zap number 0 and said,
Whoa.
don't tell anyone I gave this to you. I could lose my job.
Yeah,
And I
that's
brought it
risky.
home. And, reading Meatball was just like, whoa, the blinders came off. That's when I realized anything I imagined, if I had the skill to get it on paper, I could do it.
Yeah.
And I never would have realized that if it hadn't been for the undergrounds. And it was all the undergrounds. I read everything I could get my hands on. I immediately got my hands on a Bud Plant catalog. I don't remember how I first found out about it, but living in northern Vermont, we had a couple of hippie bookstores. There was a bookshop called The Little Professor, and there was this huge bookstore in Waitsfield, Vermont, that was called the Vermont Bookshop. They had a rack of underground comics, and that's where I first was buying undergrounds. And somewhere along the line, I found out about Bud Plant, and I got his mail order catalog on a regular basis, and I bought everything. And I mean everything, Dan. I loved the women's comics as they were coming out. I loved those little mini, Penny Dreadful, not Penny Dreadful, Tijuana Bible type pornographic comics.
Yeah.
S. Clay and
I mean, that's a testament to Bud and his taste.
Yeah, and Bud had his zine Promethean Enterprises, which was like, whoa, interviews with these people,
Yeah, I really want to interview Bud myself. He's on my list of guys I have yet to reach out to.
See,
but
that's why I can't say Ron Turner the greatest. I'm not dissing
totally.
Ron Turner.
Yeah, no, totally.
For me, Bud Plant was the conduit to all that treasure. Right?
The only reason I say like Ron maybe the greatest is because he was there at the beginning, and he's still there now.
But so is Rick Veitch.
True. True enough.
So is Robert Crumb. I mean, Crumb is still producing work, so, but I agree. And my tastes favored Ron Turner's publications. I mean, I was a Slow Death and Skull reader. But, George Arlington, would we have the underground comics movement without the work that Arlington had done? Would we have, if Don Donahue hadn't done what he did as a public? There were a number of people back then. And then you began to have the collaborations where creators would edit and package, anthology comics. When Jack Jackson and Richard Corbin did their 3D color comic, I mean, that was revelatory at that time. And you also had these amazing zines, like I subscribed to Mike Barrier's Funny World, which is primarily an animation magazine. But Mike Barrier had his finger on the pulse of what was happening in comics. And I think the first color Richard Corbin comic story I ever saw was one of the pieces published in Funny World, right? It was a comic story that was included in an issue of Funny World. And that's what it took back then to kind of keep track of what was going on. It's like, you had to have a wide fishing net that you were throwing out there, because I wasn't just looking for tuna. I wanted all of it, the cephalopods, I wanted all of it. I wanted to read all of it, and it was all mind opening.
And without that network, I don't know that we have the network today of like independent bookstores. I guess they are, and head shops and places that were like willing to take a chance and cater to this kind of material.
Well,
There's less and less of those.
You're right, but now it's all online. Let's face it. There are, and I know this is a frustration for retailers, and I know it's going to be a major frustration for historians and researchers. But crowdfunding has revolutionized how comics are created and published. The problem is some of the best work that I've read that I purchased through crowdfunding is no longer available once it's published.
Right.
The crowdfunding process prints to order, understandably enough. They are using crowdfunding in order to not have to interface with traditional publishing and traditional retail. But that means we are seeing just momentous work being created and published right now that is going to be completely inaccessible in 6 months, in 1 year, in 10 years. Where are you who is going to be able to assess what's happening right now in comics? So in a way, the diversity is too great, you might say.
It's just tough because for a consumer, now instead of what used to be, I could make a regular trip to a comic store with a retailer who knows what I like and knows what people like and is tapped into the industry and can put the stuff right in front of you. You can flip through it and buy it right now at what you deem to be a reasonable price. I'm not saying that crowdfunding is worse or better.
It's different.
There's trade-offs. Yeah.
That's a big trade-off. Bob Sikoriak, who's a friend, I met Bob Sikoriak through James Sturm at the Center for Cartoon Studies. Bob Sikoriak said very accurately about 10 years ago that it used to be you could walk into a comic shop every week and you could actually keep track of almost everything that was going on in comics.
Oh, yeah.
And as of, say, the year 2000, that was simply no longer possible. And now that you and I are talking, January 2022, it's impossible. There is no way that anyone can fathom what is going on right now in comics, and we're in a real golden age. I mean, the best comics I've ever read in my life are being published right now.
And of all stripes,
all stripes, all genres, of all time, and it's
all
only going to get better.
For the first time, and the big publishers are competing for the best of the best from the indies and underground tradition people. Joe Sacco.
Well, define big publisher for me.
I don't know, Abrams and you're right. And Random House and all the big publishers.
The mainstream now is Scholastic, Abrams, and so on. DC and Marvel are no longer the mainstream. They are the fringe.
Yeah.
That's the ghetto of comics right now. There's still good work being done there. There's still some great work being done there, but that's the fringe. The mainstream, and the shift happened right around between 2000 and 2015. The mainstream has moved on. The mainstream is elsewhere.
Agreed. And some of the hardcore I'm sorry, I'm getting a little echo. This is my fault, I think. Some of the really hardcore comics fans are old school comics fans are upset about that. Like they go, the comics industry is dying because they see superhero periodicals.
It's always been like that. It's always been like that. I had comics amigos at Johnson State College that when they would see underground comics, they'd go, "Those aren't comics." And you go, "Why?" And they go, "They're not in color." I remember when Raw #1 came out, and I bought it off a newsstand kiosk in New York City, right? It was clipped up there along with, Andy Warhol Interview magazine and those oversized magazines. And I saw it and I was like, "Oh my God, I got to have it." And I bought it and I brought it back to my little dwelling in New Jersey with my Keyword School classmates. And I had friends that went, "This isn't comics, right? This isn't comics." And I was like, "This is totally comics. In fact, this is where comics should be headed." And, now it's revered. My students would practically worship the original printings of Raw when I would bring in my stack, It's always
what about Japanese comics? Like, so many of these guys ignore that and they go, "That's not comics."
Manga heaven.
It's like, how stupid could you be when manga is the Japanese word for comics to begin with, let alone the amazing breadth of subject matter that they have.
If you loved Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby horror comics, you should be reading Junji Ito, right? Junji Ito's manga. This is my favorite horror comic right now, is, anything that's collecting. And this is collecting his old work. This is the work he did we hadn't seen yet in translated form that he did before Uzumaki and so on.
His stuff is some of the stuff when I was younger that I looked at and it made me, I had to viscerally turn away from it.
It's too freaky.
It's the most horrific stuff, and it's not because it has the most disgusting drawings or anything about it. There's
that's got nothing to do with it. Yeah,
that he captures. It's amazing.
Ito taps into, the scariest comic when I was a kid, when I was 7, was those 2 Dell comics that John Stanley scripted, Ghost Stories #1 and Tales from the Tomb. And I bring them up because John Stanley understood how kids' minds work, and he also understood what plucked those little aquifers in our unconscious mind that were disturbing. And Junji Ito does that for me. It's completely irrational work a lot of times. And that's why it works. But I agree with you. I mean, manga.
I'll tell you who says it. It's those people that and these are the guys that dominate comic book YouTube, that say the comic book industry is dying, and that the sales charts that you see where comics are going through the roof that's all manga and kids comics, so that doesn't count, and comics are dying. So the answer is, who says manga isn't comics? Morons say manga isn't comic.
Well, it's every generation goes through this, When I love cinema, and I won't dwell on this, but cinema in many ways is more important to me than comics as a consumer.
Okay.
And the movies that were exciting me when I was growing up were, Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns, Mario Bava Italian horror movies. When I finally saw it at age 15 or 16, Night of the Living Dead. All of these were despised by mainstream media. All of
True.
these got horrible reviews when they were
True.
reviewed at all. And this was the work that was transformative. This is the work that was changing cinema. And it always comes out of the woodwork, and the same is true with comics.
Steve. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry.
Well,
what I want to say is, so speaking of horror and comics, but maybe not horror. Let's talk about sophisticated suspense, shall we?
Oh, you mean any word except horror? Yes.
Yes. So tell me about sophisticated suspense, and tell me about how this project happened, because this was the thing that opened up the mainstream comics world to Alan Moore but two, to just a revolutionary new way of looking at comics. I think like a new way to reboot an old concept and pay homage to the original, but still take it in a bold new direction. Just tell us about Swamp Thing.
Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing was a comic that, when it was originally launched in 1971, 72, by writer Len Wein and artist Bernie Wrightson, became like this lightning rod for anyone who loved, monster movies and horror media at that time, because it was issue by issue, self-standing story by self-standing story, both a summation and a propulsion unit for the entire horror genre. Len and Bernie did their werewolf story. Len and Bernie did their Frankenstein story, which was the Patchwork Man. Len and Bernie took those 10 issues and retold almost every key archetype of the horror genre that their generation had grown up with via comic books and movies and television, right? They did their zombie story. They did their alien invasion story. When Swamp Thing was revived, and it was revived by DC Comics because two producers, Melniker and Uslan, bought the rights to make movie adaptations of two characters: Batman, which eventually yielded the Tim Burton directed Batman movie, and the other property they went for was Swamp Thing. And Wes Craven, low budget, independent horror filmmaker who had cut his teeth in the 70s with two pretty brutal drive-in hits. The Last House on the Left, which came out in 72, and The Hills Have Eyes, which came out in 77. When Wes Craven was contracted to direct a feature film adaptation of Swamp Thing, almost no money. They shot it in Louisiana. Makeup expert Bill Munns did the makeup, but he was working with very little means and very little money. That was enough for DC to relaunch Swamp Thing as its own series. And when I couldn't hear you earlier in the show, I saw the picture of Paul Levitz come up. Are you talking to Paul soon?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Ask Paul about why they relaunched Swamp Thing. I've been told over the years that at some point Paul had said to Len Wein, "We'll only relaunch Swamp Thing if this artist, Tom Yates, is the artist on the book." But I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
Please ask Paul, because I'd be curious to know myself. So Tom Yates was one of our classmates. He also attended Kubert School as part of that first class, 76 to 78. Tom and I are still friends. Tom's mission in life, his modus operandi as a cartoonist, is Tom was in love with a form of comics that had fallen out of favor, much as I was in love with horror comics, which had fallen out of favor. Tom was in love with adventure comics. And adventure comic strips were a dying art form at that time, in part because of, and I won't go on and on about this the way I would in the classroom, it was because of the shrinking of the size of Sunday comics.
Sure, you can't get a Terry and the Pirates or
yeah,
whatever in
the
the space
scope
that they
was
were
gone.
offered.
You know, the scope, the canvas had shrunk too much. And in traditional mainstream four-color comic publishing, which was mainstream in the mid-70s, superheroes were the coin of the realm. There were no more horror comics. There were no more adventure comics. You know, in fact, DC's title Adventure Comics had become Legion of Superheroes, right? Literally, the title had been retired and it was Legion of Superheroes. Tom said yes to Swamp Thing because he thought, oh, I'll be drawing the swamps in Louisiana. That's kind of like drawing Edgar Rice Burroughs' Jungles of Tarzan, right? It's the same kind of vegetative forms and so on. And Swamp Thing is like a muscular, naked male character. That's kind of like Tarzan. Okay.
No pressure following up Wrightson, though? I mean,
well, there was. I mean, we all felt that. But, you know, I also what I was leading to is there was only one of us in our Kubert School circle who really loved Swamp Thing. And that was John Totleben. John Totleben loved Bernie Wrightson and that school of illustrative comic art, right? Wrightson, Frazetta, the roots that it had in artists like pen and ink artists like Franklin Booth, masters of pen and ink who had worked in the pulp field like Virgil Finley. That
next level craftsman.
That's where John Totleben lived, right? That was John's bailiwick. And at the time, he couldn't find commercial work because, I mean, I was with John at a interview that he and I went up to at DC when we were interviewed by their art director at that time, who shall remain nameless because I don't want to cast him into infamy by naming him with what he said. But he looked at John Tolleben's work and he basically said, "This is great, but this is too good for comics.
Yeah, that's
we don't have anything for you, right?" And so, you know, John was having a tough time getting his any kind of foothold because he was being told point blank by some art directors, including John Workman up at Heavy Metal, "This work is great. I'd love to publish it. I don't know what to do with it," right? And John was sticking to it. You know, he had a gig at the time that was a bread and butter gig for him, but it wasn't being published. It was like a private commission kind of thing. He was illustrating the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam for a private client. And so Tom Yates was like the perfect artist at the perfect time that Len Wein and Paul Levitz decided they were going to relaunch Swamp Thing. The problem was twofold. Tom doesn't really like horror, okay? And the more that Swamp Thing moved away from the swamps, which happened at the end of the first issue, suddenly the appeal was going out of it. You know, the adventure hook that existed in the concept of Swamp Thing turned into kind of a travelogue.
I see.
Writer Marty Pasco immediately took Swamp Thing out of the swamp and did sort of a sojourn around. It was kind of Easy Rider, right? Looking for America. And everywhere they went in America, this meant that Swamp Thing was in a boxcar, in the back of a truck, in a crate. You know, it's like it wasn't the gig that Tom was hoping for.
Didn't let him establish that milieu or whatever, that scene and deeply explore the swamp settings. And
there was no right. And he fell out of, you know, and also the pressure cooker was intense. Tom was penciling and inking both. Right.
Wow.
And
wow.
The book started behind schedule, not because of anything Tom did or didn't do, was my understanding, but it was because, typical of publishers, you know, you put a team together and they want the first issue now. And there was a whole falderall around. I won't go into the details, but basically the Swamp Thing movie was scheduled to come out at a certain time, and DC wanted to hit that mark.
I see.
And then the movie got pulled and it got dumped. Basically, the distributor Avco Embassy changed hands. They got purchased by another corporate entity that didn't like horror, and so they dumped the Swamp Thing movie essentially into the matinee and third run circuit.
Yeah.
So
Where
so
and I remember seeing it. It's almost a forgotten early comic book adaptation. It doesn't even get talked about
no,
very
no,
often.
where it found its audience was on cable. It turned
That's
into
where
one of
I
those
saw it.
it turned into one of those movies that HBO or Showtime or whoever the movie channel was at that time. They just showed it over and over and over again on rotation. And it was,
Adrian Barbeau, if I'm not mistaken,
well, there you
was
go. I remember when
prominently featured.
I remember when HBO was a new thing, and one of my friends jokingly said, "Yeah, HBO. That means hey, Beastmaster's on," because Beastmaster was one of those movies, right? Like Swamp Thing, that was always on that network.
You
Um,
know how much Keef they needed for Beastmaster?
oh, a lot.
They needed Miles O'Keefe.
Yeah, yeah. He wasn't in Beastmaster. He was in Tarzan the Ape Man. Oh,
Oh,
good joke. Wrong
see,
title. Wrong
sorry.
title, Dan. Well, good try though. Um,
I
but
thought it was
anyway,
Miles.
but no, it wasn't Miles. It was the guy that was in V, the blonde guy that was the hero of the TV series V. I'm forgetting his name right now, but
Okay.
blonde guy, mullet. You know, You Light Up
How
My
much?
Life was his starring vehicle. Somebody's going to pop up with his name. So anyway, what this has to do with Tom is the book was
Yeah.
behind schedule before he started, and he was penciling and inking. So that took part of the fun out of it as well. It's like he was always behind the eight ball, and that's how the book was on schedule for all of us in perpetuity. You were always behind. I was always behind, certainly. Um, and around issue 2, Tom began to tap John Toddleman and Rick Veitch, who would assist Tom on issues to get the deadlines met. But Tom would be doing, Tom would have John pencil some figures or have Rick do some layouts or something. And then I got pulled in with Saga of the Swamp Thing #8. I laid out that issue. We were extending that relationship we had when we had shared a house. By this time, we had all gone our separate ways. We were, John Toddleman was back in Erie, Pennsylvania. Rick Veitch was back in Vermont. I now had married and was starting my family in southern Vermont. But we would, make the pilgrimage out to Lake Hopatcong, where Tom Yates lived at that time, and kick in for a couple days to a week and help Tom. And this meant that by the time Tom decided he was going to leave the book, he suggested that Talbot and I might make a good team, because John and I, just as Rick and I had jammed on pieces just for fun, John and I really hit it off from the first day we met. And we had jammed on, individual drawings and stuff. And we were definitely in the same wheelhouse in terms of loving, monsters and strange, grotesque forms and so on. And the one thing John had that I'll never have is he drew amazing, beautiful women. And that's also why Tom said, you two would be a good team, because John would make Abby really work as a character, and the both of you have a handle on Swamp Thing. And that's how we got employed by Tim Truman, another one of our Kubert School classmates. Tim was I think the third group of students who came through Kubert School. So he started the fall that we had graduated, but we became friends with Tim and Beth Truman very early on, close friends. And Tim was commissioned by Dungeons and Dragons, TSR, to put together a group of artists to design a toy line. They wanted to have their own toy line. They were doing those pewter D&D figures that were incredibly detailed, and they wanted to have a plastic action figure line. So Tim Truman rang us all up and put together like his dream team. And it was Rick Veitch, Tom Yates, John Toddleman, me, a number of classmates who lived closer, Tom Mandrake, Jan Dursema, Ron Randall. We would work in the daytime in this room at a hotel that was like the sweatshop. Tim had, more chairs and tables in there. We would all work for 8 hours on the TSR job. And then at night, Talbot and I would go back to one room or the other of the rooms we were in, and we would jam on sample pages of Swamp Thing. And we delivered 2 sets of samples. We delivered a set where I penciled and John inked, and we delivered a set where John penciled and I inked.
I want to take a look while we're talking Swamp Thing.
Okay, cool.
I might as well join. I think I want to talk about this at
Well,
some point. But
yeah. Let's go back to 41 after we walk through the beginning of Swamp Thing.
I will. I'd love to talk with you and Rick about this
Oh
sometime
God,
too.
would we survive? Who will survive, and what will be left of them? So Swamp Thing. So John and I ended up getting the gig. Tom Yates brought in our samples, and Len Wein looked at our samples and went, right, Steve's the stronger storyteller and has the stronger sense of page design and panel flow. You're the penciler. John, you've got the better ink line. Your ink line is gorgeous. You're the inker. And that became the team. And that issue you just had open, the anatomy lesson, which was the first, it wasn't the first of the Alan Moore issues, and it wasn't even the first of our issues. We actually started with issue number 16, written by Marty Pasco. And so John and I had done the artwork on 3 complete issues and 1 partial issue before Marty Pasco left the book and Alan Moore came on. So by the time of the anatomy lesson, you know, John and I were firing on all cylinders. Like, we had put it together. We had a good teamwork, and we had a good flow of work, and we had a look that we were both aiming for. And
what was that? What was that you were aiming for?
We were trying to, you know, it was a little different modus operandi for each of us. I was looking to, I wanted to kick the stops out of all the doors. My modus operandi was to smash the page, right? I had been working by this time professionally since 1977. And this is 1983 when I started work on Swamp Thing. I hated that rectangle that we were locked into. So my modus operandi was, how do I break up the look and shape of the page while maintaining perfect storytelling and flow of reading? How do I do that? So my modus operandi was busting that page. I wanted to tell the story using every tool in the toolkit of how page design affects you emotionally. And you can see in this story, the anatomy lesson, I was ready to go. And when we got that first Alan Moore script, the first issue Alan scripted, I did not work on. The first issue he scripted was issue 20. And we were so behind schedule that Len Wein had John Talbot working on issue 20 while I was starting work on the pencils of issue 21.
So I don't mean to interrupt your flow here.
No, interrupt me, please.
How did Alan Moore become involved? Like, when did that switch?
Yeah, that's great. You know, Alan's work was beginning to be visible in America with the comic retailers who were importing Wizard magazine. Okay. And to answer Martyr Media, it was Len Wein that put Alan Moore, Steve Bissette, and John Talbot and Rick Veitch together. We never would have come together organically on our own. It was because Len Wein, at the point when Marty Pasco said, okay, I'm leaving the book, I'm not going to write it anymore. Marty was making much more money writing for Saturday morning animated cartoons at that time. Okay. And it was Len Wein who reached out to Alan Moore. Now, to answer your question, Dan, the magazine Warrior was being published in the UK. And Warrior, from its first issue, it was a black and white anthology comic magazine. And from the first issue, it featured Marvel Man, which Alan Moore was scripting. And Alan Davis and Gary Leach were the initial artists on Marvel Man. And V for Vendetta, which Alan Moore was scripting and David Lloyd was the artist on. And I bought Warrior every issue from Heroes World, which was the comic shop in New Jersey in driving distance of our existence in New Jersey. And so Rick Veitch, John Talbot, and I were all reading Warrior as the issues reached American retailers. We were buying them as they hit. And
which was how far behind their publication in the UK?
I don't know, because I never gauged the month of a given issue. I still have the complete set of Warrior here. And
But it wasn't a huge gap. It wasn't like a multi-year gap.
No. But I mean, at that time, Titan was the primary, and they still are. The Titan were the primary distributor in the UK, and they were buying American product to distribute, and they were distributing British product to American distribution. And at that time, it was Capital, Diamond. There were a number of smaller distributors at that time. I don't remember when Friendly Franks came into operation, but Andromeda in Canada, Neptune in Canada. And so we were probably getting Warrior magazine within a month to 2 months of each issue coming out in the UK. Well, Len Wein saw Warrior, and Len Wein was reading Warrior. And Len Wein, out of the blue, without any preparatory letter or contact, this is before the internet, before email existed, Len Wein cold called Alan Moore.
Wow.
And Alan Moore thought it was one of his friends joking and hung up. And Len Wein, thank the stars above, called Alan back immediately and went, "No, I'm really Len Wein. And I want you to take over the scripting on Swamp Thing." Now, at this time, Alan had been also scripting Time Twisters for 2000 AD. And he had never had a 22-page, 23-page canvas to work with, right? Because the installments of Marvel Man and the installments of V for Vendetta were relatively short. They weren't 20-something pages each. So for Alan, it was opening up, what was possible for him with a given script. And it also paid very well compared to what the UK publishers were paying. So Alan said yes, and we began corresponding immediately. We could not afford to call each other on the phone at that time, and we were exchanging voluminous letters. I have kept every letter I got from Alan Moore. And John was writing Alan, I was writing Alan. John and I were talking on the phone between ourselves, as we had for years, and Alan was writing to both John and I. And our letters all crossed in the mail. And it turned out we all wanted to do the same thing with Swamp Thing. Every one of us wanted to go the same way. And it took off from there. We found other points of commonality. Alan and I both were very much still in the thrall of the underground comics of the 70s. And you can see that in the double-page spreads that you're showing everybody right now. And Alan and I were both fans of a British filmmaker named Nicholas Roeg, who did Performance in 1970 with Mick Jagger, Walkabout, Don't Look Now with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, The Man Who Fell to Earth with David Bowie. Alan and I both loved that mosaic approach to storytelling that Nicholas Roeg practiced in his films, which was very disorienting for a lot of people, but which we found exciting. Where, yes, you tell a linear story, but the emotional high point of your story might actually be in the middle of the linear narrative. So you can build the story, telling your story from the beginning and the end simultaneously to arrive at your emotional climax.
Yeah.
And that really served the serialized periodical form of a comic like Swamp Thing quite well, right? It might not have served as well if we had been doing a graphic novel at that time, because I don't know if publishers would have gone for it. The other cartoonist and graphic novelist I can mention, Dan, was Brian Talbot, who with Luther Arkwright was very much also incorporating some of the storytelling devices and tools that Nicholas Roeg had introduced in cinema. And Brian Talbot was bringing it into his Luther Arkwright series. And if anyone's interested, particularly in why Alan and myself and John and Rick took the approach we did with Swamp Thing, take a look at what Brian Talbot was doing with Luther Arkwright before and during the same time, because we were all coming from a similar orientation to this is what's possible in comics that we haven't seen anybody do yet.
I was going to say that Brian Talbot is one of those guys that, I mean, he's certainly well known and respected, but not as much in this country and not as well known. And it's interesting that you say that you guys took some inspiration from Luther Arkwright, because it clearly shows in a lot of the stuff that Moore writes, the multiversal stuff and everything.
Yeah. And it's not that Alan was imitating Brian, and it's not that I was imitating Brian. We were all just, we were all excited by that potential in comics that we were too rarely seeing anyone even attempt in comics.
Did you read Slow Death?
I say again?
His new stuff in Slow Death Zero?
Oh, God. Brian's a master. I mean, Brian is just a master. And the work he's doing, I mean, Brian does... I did a career-length interview with Brian that I still have to get out in book form, published. And when I finished the interview, by the time I was putting the book together, he had already done 2 more graphic novels. I mean, the guy is a dynamo. And his wife has been doing a lot of very innovative work in graphic novels as well, collaboratively with Brian and with other creative partners.
I didn't know that.
There's so much great work out of Europe, the UK, Asia, the Philippines that we're just not aware of here in America at all. So
this is what's. I don't mean to hijack this whole thing.
No, please do. Yeah.
Just to show this.
This is amazing.
But this and Rick Veitch's piece.
Oh,
in Slow Death Zero. Yeah, this is the Slow Death Zero. If you want to see more about this, guys, by the way, guys, I did a whole interview with Ron Turner and Colin Turner and
John Cook
and John Cook.
Right.
And you can see more about that there.
So we were bringing that to the work we were doing on Swamp Thing. We were also inspired by what Frank Miller had done at Marvel with Daredevil. And we were also getting away with experimenting for 2 reasons. Number one, the sales of Swamp Thing were so bad when we started that I guess the attitude was, well, they can't fuck it up.
Yeah, totally.
And the other factor was, as long as Len was happy, nobody was really looking over anybody's shoulder at this time. It wasn't until the sales began to pick up that we began to feel the pressure of DC. Whenever you're doing something that comes out of nowhere that becomes in any way successful, there are suddenly many, many cooks who enter the kitchen.
Sure.
The metaphor I remember, and I can almost tell you which issue it happened with. I remember John Talbot during one of our phone conversations saying, yeah, we got the car on the road and now they want us in the back seat. And that was pretty much at the point when I was ready to go and was beginning to disengage from working in the series. But before that, it was the greatest creative chemistry I had felt outside of the work I had done with Rick Veitch.
Yeah. I think that screams from the page. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people are always drawn to this work. Like it was just such a newness. And then to have familiar faces from the DC universe.
Yeah. I hated that shit. Rick had to come in and help pencil those JLA pages. Because this is how much I resented the JLA being introduced. I only found out later that Len and Alan agreed to tell me that Len had made Alan put the superheroes in. Because when I got that script, I was like, what are these fucking superheroes doing in here? Of course, Alan wanted to play in the DC universe ballpark, and I understand that. But at the time, I was so fixated on revolutionizing horror comics. I wanted to bring horror comics into the 1980s, and Swamp Thing was our vehicle.
Well, can I say this, Steve? Can I say this? You succeeded. Okay, this is one of the great works of comics history. Like this is one of the ones, certainly from mainstream comics. This is where DC truly started to produce work written by and for adults. And that was not like emotionally stunted at its root. Like this was.
I never said this to anyone involved, but at the time, my model was Marv Wolfman, Gene Colan, and Tom Palmer's Tomb of Dracula, which was my favorite Marvel comic from the 1970s. And that 70-issue run of Tomb of Dracula, to my mind, is still the first great American horror graphic novel. So when we had the shot on Swamp Thing, that's why I gave it all I could creatively. I mean, I was a headache to deal with in terms of deadlines and everything. I won't go on and on about it. I won't have my Catholicism and my self-flagellation come to the fore. But, my daughter was born in April of 1983 when I was starting work on the book, a home birth. Our son was born in 1985, and my wife worked at a school for autistic children. So I was essentially a single dad during the day and staying up at night without sleep to get the pages done on Swamp Thing. So I was always behind, right?
Okay, I'm not going to say Swamp Thing is the best horror comic ever, because there's a lot of EC comics out there that were pretty amazing and laid.
There's a lot of great horror comics now.
I
mean, we are in a golden age of horror comics right now too. So,
okay, speaking of golden ages, let's move into the Silver Age for a second. I want to fast forward a little bit more.
Yeah, let's talk about 1941 briefly.
Okay, we can do that.
And then go into the Silver Age. I think I know where you're going with the Silver Age.
Cool.
Okay. And, it's funny how in a career, Rick and I get our big break, 1941. Our final project together with Alan, 1963. I don't know how those things happened, but they happened, right? Nobody orchestrated that.
There's a synergy there for sure. There's something happening.
Look at 1941. Look at that spread. I mean, Rick and I were already, stretching what we were trying to get everything out of every page that was possible.
But so this was, wait a minute. So this was pre-Swamp Thing, post-Swamp Thing?
Oh, yeah, this is 1979. This is 4 years before Swamp Thing.
Holy cow. This is, because I only read this year. I had never even seen a copy before. Some brand new copies became available. Like, I got a minty fresh copy that I'm wrecking the spine on for this interview. And this blew me away because I didn't know what to expect.
We went apeshit, We went apeshit.
This is a multimedia extravaganza.
Oh yeah.
That would be tough to pull off with Photoshop, and so
we did it all with scissors, paper, and Elmer's glue, baby. So
okay, I'm just gonna leaf through this while you talk about it a little bit.
Well, Rick and I got the contract to do 1941, and we were told that they originally had approached Alex Toth, and Alex Toth said no. So John Workman, who had bought work from me for Heavy Metal. I was one of the first American cartoonists to get their foot in the door at Heavy Metal. And he had purchased work from Rick Beach. So he knew our work, and he had been seeing our portfolios, including the work we were hoping Heavy Metal would buy, for like 5 years. Well, no, not 5 years. So 2 years by this point. And so he decided, well, if we can't get Alex Toth, I'll go in the other direction, and let's see if Steve and Rick will do it. And we said yes. We were starving. We were eager to get our big break. Here's a Steven Spielberg movie, his first movie after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? And it was a collaboration between Universal Studios and Columbia. It was a big deal. And we got the gig.
Rick, keep talking, okay? Keep talking. You're not going to see me for a second.
Okay, we got the gig, and we had to steal the movie script in order for Rick to finish the adaptation and page breakdowns for us to do the graphic novel adaptation. In fact, the studios were so paranoid that we had to, John Workman, the art director at Heavy Metal, had to orchestrate a theft of the reference material that the rep from Universal/Columbia had brought up to the Heavy Metal office. This suit, thought that he could bring up 35 millimeter slides and project them on a wall, and that Rick and I could sit down and do all the sketches we needed to do in one afternoon to them
without giving you access to them.
Right. We weren't going to have any further access to them. So, and John saw how impossible this was, right? We're supposed to do an afternoon of sketches, and then we had 3 months or so in which to do a fully painted graphic novel adaptation. It was crazy. So John convinced the guy to go to lunch. And while the guy was at lunch, he rushed the slides into their photostat room. And Rick and I went home with black and white photostats of every one of those slides. That was our reference for all the actors, all the costumes, all the props. We also found out, like, I was rubbing my hands together, like, oh my God, We get to draw Christopher Lee and Toshiro Mifune, two of my favorite actors on the planet. And John Workman said, well, you can't draw Toshiro Mifune because he has a clause in his contract that his likeness cannot be
Oh my
used
gosh.
in any promotion or merchandising connected with the film. So that's when Rick and I went, you know what? Fuck it. All these chips are stacked against us. We went to a like antique shop in Morristown, New Jersey. And we bought the entire set of Life magazine from the year 1941.
Whoa.
From January, it was a weekly newsstand, oversized magazine, heavily illustrated from January to the end of December 1941. So we knew anything we clipped and used would be correct to the time period. Also, as of Pearl Harbor.
And that was just a reference file for you.
Well, it started as reference, but what it turned into was all the collage material we worked in here, all those advertising characters, all those, anything we cut and paste in there, almost all of it's from those Life magazines from the year 1941.
Any legal problems you think with?
Not at the time. In 1979, nobody gave a shit about that stuff.
Yeah.
Now it would be, it's like you and I were talking before the show about how sampling in music, it has, become prohibitively expensive because of the cost of sampling. Nobody gave a shit when we were doing this. And, there's Mr. Peanut. Go back to that double page. There's Mr. Peanut. We made him a character, right? He's dancing on the diagonal on the facing page on the right.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
If you go through the entire book, man, Mr. Peanut is on every page. Our model was my favorite Karl Barks character was Gyro Gearloose. And Gyro Gearloose had that little robot assistant who had a light bulb for a head. Yeah. And what I loved about Karl Barks' Gyro Gearloose is there was always a second silent story with what was happening with the little assistant that had nothing to do with the Gyro Gearloose story you were reading. So we made Mr. Peanut our character. We didn't worry about licensing Mr. Peanut. We just took Mr. Peanut and made him a character.
I saw something recently that said, is there a better representation of capitalism than a peanut with a top hat and a monocle selling you other peanuts to eat?
Exactly. That's how you just put your finger on. That's how Rick saw the world. And that's how I was coming to see the world. Rick being more mature and worldly than little old me. And, we just went nuts with that. We went, if we're not allowed to do certain things, if we have to steal the material to do this book, let's just go nuts. And our reference point was Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder with Mad Magazine.
That shows. I mean, that's what it screams from the very beginning.
Mad
Magazine.
And the risk we took, which John Workman was into, and luckily Heavy Metal was into, was, this is an entire movie about xenophobia. This is an entire movie about World War II propaganda. So if we can't draw Toshiro Mifune's likeness, let's use the grotesque propaganda, racist, xenophobic caricature of the Japanese as characters. And we weren't adopting it in order to mock the Japanese culture, the Japanese people. We were mocking the propaganda of the time. We were mocking how those stereotypes and how those kind of racist caricatures are implemented as a capitalist weapon of war.
And I just don't think they knew what they were getting when they hired you guys.
Oh, they had no idea, And I look at a page like that one that your hand is on.
Yeah.
I look at it and I can see, oh my God, we were almost to the end of the deadline because we drew as little as possible on that page. And there's a lot of paste ups on that page. And that was like the point where we were like, we got to get this done.
But just the layouts and everything, this is like your signature, the type of stuff that we were looking at in the Swamp Thing back there. Barely a single page has a standard grid. And those that do have it for a reason that serves the story.
Right. And the big difference is with 1941, we were busting that grid in order to go apeshit. With Swamp Thing, it was very intentional. It was it was like taking this crazy energy and going, okay, what do I do if I dial that back and now I'm going to use it to scare the reader or to disturb the reader or to touch the reader. Because there were also Swamp Thing issues that were not horrific in nature, the love issue, for instance. So, but yeah, that's why I wanted you to go back to 41. Here is the proof of that Rick Veitch and I were already working very hard to bust open. Yeah, I think that was a fun page. And you can see that's Rick's pencils on John.
That's what I was about to say. It's so Rick.
And that's my inks.
Yeah. And and you can feel that.
And we just went to town,
This book was incredible. It's so dense and so weird and so graphically strong, though, and I'm just not used to this kind of color.
Nobody was.
In a work this old. Even if this came out today, I would go like, oh wow, this guy is a Photoshop master or something. Like this.
This was Rick working with airbrush. This was Rick and I working together using Dr. Martin dyes. The colors were just vibrant on the page. And we used every trick in the book, and that's Rick's lettering. Rick is a master of sound effects and lettering.
Well, and nobody, and you know what? Nobody asked you. Nobody needed you to put this level of. It's so much more work than anybody has ever put into adapting a movie to comic book form. They're usually the worst comics imaginable, and this is visually, certainly, it's a masterpiece. It's incredible. I really
Spielberg hated it.
So tell me that. Let's finish off with that. Tell me this.
Spielberg hated this.
Is he just a dummy? Is he just a dummy?
Well, I don't think, we knew when we read the script that the script was laugh out loud funny. It had a genuinely funny script. But we knew when we saw that letter that the movie was not going to work before we'd even seen the movie. We got invited to the New York City premiere. All the Saturday Night Live people were there and everything. We didn't get to meet any of them. We were lowly cartoonists, but John Workman and Julie Simmons Lynch got us tickets to the premiere, and you could feel the air just suck out of the theater in the first half hour of the movie. It just wasn't working. It wasn't clicking. And I say that because I don't think Spielberg understood the script himself. The letter he sent to Julie Simmons Lynch complaining about our artwork, he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, you took your mad artists took our perfectly funny homespun domestic comedy and turned it into a Boschian nightmare, cannibalistic Boschian nightmare. And
you made it something good. I'm sorry. You took a stinker. You took a rare Spielberg stinker and turned it into a gem of comics. This thing is amazing.
We just saw this as this is our chance to lance the boil of American propaganda, wartime propaganda, which we've all experienced in our lifetimes multiple times already. We've all seen how the media machine revs up, how the media integrates its various profit-making messages with whatever the government agenda is and the military agenda is. And this was our shot at, let's make a funny comic, but tear that to shreds.
Aren't we lucky that we've come so far in 80 years that none of that stuff happens today? That's Dan, super cool.
I admire your faith in the human character. But
okay. Well, let's move from 1941
to 1963, I bet.
Yeah, let's move 22 years into the future. Where? Here. Let's go and take a look. Somewhere I've got all of these issues in here. Wait, that's not it. Sorry, wrong one. No, let's
Neil Adams, Skate Man. Whoa.
That's unofficially the best comic in the universe. So
Skate Man?
That's one of our mascots here. That's our mascot, Skate Man. But let's talk a little bit about 1963, okay? So just tell me, give us a nutshell what this project was.
What this project was by 1992, Rick Veitch, Steve Bissette, and Alan Moore, each in their respective corners of the world, had sort of boxed ourselves each individually into a losing pattern, if you will. Okay. Rick and I had been approached by Kevin Eastman when Kevin Eastman, co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, was going to start his own company called Tundra Publishing. And Rick and I had put a lot of eggs into that basket in support of Kevin. Kevin wanted us to help him. And Rick did some of his best work during those Tundra years, right? Brat Pack, started Max Immortal and completed the first Max Immortal arc. And I won't go on about that because you and Rick did a great conversation just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, thanks. Check that out if you haven't already.
I was doing Taboo with Tundra, where I was editing and co-publishing Taboo. And by the end of 91, beginning of 92, the writing was on the wall. Tundra was imploding. And I won't go into all the reasons for that. So out of the blue, I get a phone call from mutual friend Larry Marder, creator of Bean World.
Bean World, yeah.
And Larry Marder, we called him the nexus of all comic book realities at the time, because Larry was the one person we knew who understood and had this incredibly mature grasp of everything that was going on in the industry and how it all intersected. Larry had come out of Chicago advertising. He was a Chicago-based madman, if you will, if you're familiar with the TV series Mad Men.
Sure.
Mad Men. And Larry, out of the blue, called me and said, Steve, I know you're not particularly gung-ho about some of the stuff Image Comics is doing, but Jim Valentino wants to talk to you.
And Larry was editor-in-chief at Image at that moment.
Well, he was about to. He was a consultant at this time at Image, and he was about to step into a more executive consulting role at Image. I don't know what his title was per se at any point in time, but Larry had taken on a real mentor role up at Image. So I said, sure, I'll talk to Jim Valentino. I was a big fan of Normal Man, which was Jim Valentino's comic that he wrote and drew that Aardvark Vanaheim had been publishing. And Normal Man was Valentino's intersection of all comic book realities in a comic book. Normal Man was like a normal character who was free flow moving through all the comic book universes.
In a world where everyone had superpowers, he was...
Right. It was a bit like that Ryan Reynolds video game or movie that came out last year in early 2021.
Sure.
So I said, sure. I didn't know Jim, but I was aware of the work he had been doing at Marvel. You know, he was part of the generation that Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld were part of. But Jim was older. Jim was really the oldest member of the Image team, breakaway team. So I said, sure, I'll talk to him. And I got a phone call from Jim Valentino. And it was very quickly evident, no surprise to me, that really they wanted Alan Moore. It's just they didn't know how to get to Alan Moore. And I was the one person in their universe that Larry Marder had said, hey, Steve knows Alan, and had in fact, just recently published in Taboo, The Serialized from Hell, and we had just begun serializing Lost Girls, the Alan Moore, Melinda Gebbie erotic graphic novel. And so that was the reason for the call. And Valentino was calling to say, Steve, would you and Alan care to do an issue or an annual or something with my character, which his character was Nighthawk. What was his character? Help me, Dan. I'm drawing a blank. Shadowhawk. Thank you. I apologize, Jim. Brain fart. I'm 66 years old. Please forgive me. So Shadowhawk. And I knew Alan had no interest, and I knew I had no interest in working on any existing character at the Image stable. In fact, what we primarily respected about what Image had done up to that point, this is early 1992, is that they had launched their own line with their own characters. And I won't go into all the parameters of it, but I had a lot of reservations about the studio system. And I had a lot of reservations about whenever people work collaboratively, if there's one creator who owns the property at hand, then everyone else is ipso facto an employee.
Sure.
And there's a lot of unconscious and conscious dynamics at play there. And, it's just not healthy in a lot of ways. It can work, as we've all seen, but it's also a real minefield. So I wasn't interested.
Gotta have good contracts from the beginning and that kind of thing, and
Well, that's
everyone
it's funny
understands.
you say that because we never had a contract on 63.
That's why you failed.
We fucked
That's
up.
why it's.
Hey, I was the only member of the team who from day one went, let's draw up an agreement. And I was told point blank, Bissette, you're complicating things. Let's just do the work. And I bit my tongue and I said, okay, let's do the work. And then we all know, or many of us know how things went, which, but anyway, to answer your question, I came back with, well, Jim, how about if we do something of our own? And he said, like what? And I said, I'm not sure. Let me talk to Alan. And when I got off the phone with Jim, we made an appointment to talk the next day or whatever. I called not Alan first. I called Rick Beach first because I knew I was not great with deadlines and that if this was something that was going to work, it would have to be a team effort. And I also knew that, like me, with the implosion of Tundra, Rick was also facing what am I going to do next because he was losing his publisher. We all knew Tundra was going under. That was not speculative. It was a fact. And so I called Rick and I said, well, Rick, I just got this call. I related to him the conversation. And I also knew, without having a conversation yet with Alan, because my ongoing conversations with Alan, he was overworked at the time. Alan was in this situation where he was writing the most massive, demanding body of work he had ever done in his entire writing career. He was working on From Hell. He was working on Lost Girls. He was working on his first novel, The Voice of Fire, which had not been completed or published yet. And the problem he was facing is there was no money in any of these, okay? In the case of his novel, an advance had been paid, but that was long gone. From Hell and Lost Girls did not pay much. This is before, movie coming out and all that shit. So I knew this would be a factor. And in the conversation with Rick, I brought up, well, what about if we work Marvel method? What about if we propose to Alan, if he's up for working with the two of us and we've all worked together, that we would set up a situation where he wouldn't have to write full scripts. If he comes up with a story, and both Rick and I had worked with Alan extensively by this time, we knew how fertile his imagination was and how quick on his feet he was. That if he came up with stories, we could do the pencils and then he could dialogue it. And this would lighten the workload for Alan, okay? And there were a couple other factors I won't go into. So Rick said, let's try it. This could be fun. So then I called Alan.
That was before you had chosen the subject matter.
Oh, yeah. That was going to be up to Alan. Like, we didn't want to dictate what we thought we wanted to do.
Yeah,
because the other factor in this is we knew Image was a superhero company. And we also knew that Alan had been quite vocal about the regrets he was expressing over having done Watchmen.
Yes.
And Marvel Man, which had become Miracle Man by then. And that
led to an entire generation of grim and gritty comics that sort of missed the point of Watchmen altogether.
You got it. And Alan was feeling a degree of culpability in that. He felt like what he had done, what Frank Miller had done. You and Rick talked a bit about this during your conversation, right? That there was a feeling of culpability there, that the point had been missed. Rorschach was not supposed to be a role model. The Frank Miller's Dark Knight was not the embodiment of what it would be to be a great American. It was actually an embodiment of some of the dangers of vigilantism. That had somehow missed that had missed the boat. It's comparable to Easy Rider became a huge breakthrough movie hit, and then everybody made biker movies. Yeah. But nobody made a movie about exploring America and the underbelly of America. They just made crappy biker movies, right? And I love crappy biker movies. I'm not bad mouthing them, but it was like they missed the point of Easy Rider. So when I called Alan, what we had was an open invite. Jim Valentino had said, I want to godfather, for want of a better word, whatever you guys want to do, that there would be very little money up front, but that the split would be 20% to Image, 80% to the creators, meaning whatever our team was, we were going to be pocketing 80% of what the books earned. And we could do what we wanted as long as it fit, as long as it was something Image would be up for. And it was Alan who proposed the idea of, let's go, like, everybody missed the point of what was intended with the work he had done in the 80s. Let's go back to the Silver Age and let's not mock, not parody, let's lovingly emulate what it was that made the comics we had grown up with, because Rick, Alan, and I were all roughly the same age, with Rick being the oldest of the three of us. And let's do it the way they used to do it, right? That was kind of the hook. And so we went for it. I then called Jim Valentino and said, okay, Jim, we don't want to do Shadowhawk. Here's what Alan's proposing. And I thought Jim would go for it because it was sort of a variation on Normal Man, right? I mean, it was not our copying what Jim had done with Normal Man, but it was in Jim Valentino's wheelhouse, if you will, right? And I knew Valentino would get it because he was also of our generation and he loved the idea of it. And the further we got into pulling it together over a matter of a week or two in terms of just the bare bones concept, we all decided, let's do it on newsprint. Let's do it exactly the way comics used to be done. And so that the very format would fly in the face of the cutting edge computer generated color and very slick nature of the Image comics. Because Image, part of the Image revolution is they had revolutionized what color comics looked like, what color comics could be. And a lot of people forget that.
The future is now, and the future has gradients.
Well, it wasn't just gradients. It was also full page bleeds. And there were all these things that Image did where they just sort of cut loose. And some of it, drawing pages as pinups because the original art sells for more, that does not help or in any way aid storytelling. But it was another way of catering to the market as it existed at that time. On the other hand, we also were taking a gamble. Like, if we went this route, maybe they wouldn't sell. So maybe we wouldn't end up making much for this endeavor. Long story short, Valentino, Rick and I said, okay, we got to have some sort of a structure with a modest advance so that Alan and Steve and Rick and the people we work with can afford to do this work. But it was a very low rate for everything because we all knew we were going to get a share of the back end. And it was a significant share. No publisher in America would give anybody 80% of anything.
Kind of nuts.
It was nuts. I mean, that's what we liked about Images. They were nuts. And Larry Marder was kind of our shepherd through all this because Larry would explain to us, look, you guys got to understand, here's how Image works. And here's how Image doesn't work. But we knew Valentino was going to honor his commitment to us. And Jim was a very honorable man through the entire process. What led to our tackling the project is Rick found a studio, a rental studio, geographically right between his house and where I was living at the time. And we met there 2 or more days a week, and we worked together in the same studio. And Rick
had a bullpen.
Right. And Rick's reason was he was thinking, well, I'll crack the whip on Bissette. And my thinking was, if I've got to go up there and be with Rick, I'll have the work done. Or I'll get the work done because I feed off that energy. The energy would be like it was when we were living in the house in Dover and we were a hallway apart from each other. And it worked. And at the time, what was paying my family's bills was every Friday, I was the promotional manager at a local video superstore, First Run Video in Brattleboro, Vermont, which was a video operation that I had been a shareholder in since 1991. And
Hmm.
by being the promo manager 1 day a week, I could bring home a paycheck every Friday. And that allowed me to stay on top of our basic bills that my first wife and I were dealing with, while Rick and I got our respective pencils done on Swamp Thing, because we didn't get paid on the pencils until we vouchered for, the job at hand. And and we didn't want to rig the system. I mean, we were very conscientious about trying to finish our whole installment and then get paid for that issue or whatever. But this was done on a shoestring, Dan. We were, there were weeks where we were hanging on by our thumbnails, and not just Rick and I, Alan as well. I mean, he was supporting, a family and more, because I believe he was helping out or taking care of other family members as well. And a lot of the energy that went into 1963 that people enjoy was also the same kind of sort of desperation that probably fueled the original Silver Age comics, because those artists and those writers were being paid chicken feed.
Well, and also work. Let's step back in time too, because you guys put out those great Swamp Thing comics, which sold well at the time and had critical acclaim. But there was no continuing revenue stream. There were no reprint trade paperbacks.
We were being paid their lowest page rate. When we were doing Swamp Thing, I found out when I penciled 3 or 4 pages for Ambush Bug, editor Julie Schwartz saw my invoice and tore it up over the phone. He said, "Steve, listen." And I hear paper tearing. And I said, "What was that?" He says, "I just did you a favor. I tore up your invoice. You're going to get paid Keith Giffen's rate." And Julie Schwartz, the one that told me, he said, "Why did you put down $63 a page?" I said, "That's what we're getting. That's what I get for Swamp Thing." And he went, "That's the lowest rate up here right now." So we were not just not earning royalties, Dan. We had done all that Swamp Thing work at the lowest rate DC paid.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying. And did they even have royalty deals in place at that point?
Well, yeah, but the book wasn't selling enough. At that time, the royalty plan was based on a threshold, and we were nowhere near it.
Sure.
Swamp Thing. We began to earn royalties once the first collection came out, and I think that was in '87. Those 2 softbound paperbacks. There was the Warner and the DC edition. And right from that point in time, when we were offered contracts, it was either a flat reprint rate or a royalty. And John and I always went for the royalty. And DC has always paid the royalties every quarter, right to the present day. They have never. There's been months like now when we haven't gotten them on the date specified, but they always come through. And DC. But at the time we were doing 1963, that was not the case. The Swamp Thing books were sort of in limbo. The whole graphic novel thing hadn't really taken off yet. So
you get paid every time they put out a new Absolute edition or softcover edition?
No, we earn on the back end off of that. For instance, we just got our last royalty check that we got, which would have been fall of 2021. We were finally seeing royalties from sales from 2020. Okay. It takes a while, and there's also many
because they print it, they sell through a certain amount of the print run through reorders. Right. Okay,
and I'm sure they hold back paying out royalties as long as possible, because as a corporation, they're earning interest on all that money that they're not paying out yet. But we've had some fat royalty paydays. I'm not complaining. Sure. But when we were doing 63, that was not the reality. We were all, we were all kind of hanging on, and we were betting on the bank that this would find a readership. Now, that comic you have up right now was the first issue of 1963. Yes. Originally, number 1 was supposed to be The Fury, and Alan Moore rang me up and said, "Steve, it would work better for the 6-issue narrative if Mystery Inc. is first. Are you okay with that?" And I said, "Sure." And part of why I said sure, twofold. A, it was Alan's baby. B, Rick Veitch had bailed my ass out of so many deadline crises that I thought, well, if anybody should earn more, because number 1 of an issue always sells more than number 2, I'm fine with that. I'm saying goodbye to a chunk of money of an unknown quantity, but if it's going to my buddy Rick, great. I owe him more than I'll ever repay in this lifetime. So
because he did all the pencils on Mystery Incorporated, and you did all the pencils on The Fury.
Right, and this is the way it worked until the last issue when I bailed because my marriage was falling apart. And
by the way, these are the 2 best. these are
Oh,
the
those are
two
the
best.
two you love? Okay.
The two best covers. My two favorite
Oh,
covers
yeah.
by far.
Well, and these were covers we reworked because if you look at the pinup pages, you'll see earlier version. Well, in the Fury,
Yes. Yeah.
the pinup
The
page is the
Fury.
early
Yeah.
draft of the cover, and Alan had a couple suggestions. And also, this is the first time Rick and I got to work with Dave Gibbons. I mean, Dave's inks are like, wow, you know, it's like, oh my God, Dave Gibbons finishing my pencils. Oh my God.
And so you penciled and Dave inked this cover.
The whole book.
Because it is
the whole book.
Yeah. The whole book is beautiful, but it's just this cover in particular. That's the one that brought me, like, when I had a choice of like which T-shirt would I want. It's the Fury T-shirt by far, man.
You know, and the thing was, we also, I mean, Rick designed all his characters in dialogue with Alan. I designed all the characters except the Hypernaut. The Hypernaut was the one character where Alan had done a drawing, and that's what I stuck to. All I did was slim him down a little bit. But the other characters, I mean, the Fury, Alan originally wanted it to be a high school kid in a devil costume with a tail and a pitchfork and like a football helmet on. And I did a drawing of that, and I went, no, this does not work. And then I came up with that design, and now that you're leaning back, I can just tell your viewers, the front of the Fury's costume, that is an open mouth. Can you see how the black stripes
totally.
teeth?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It reads. The red is the red of the mouth. And then I carried that tooth motif over to the discuses on his arm, which are kind of his boomerangs. You know, he throws them and they come back to him. And that design clicked. You know, as I was drawing it, I went, I think this works. And then once I sent it to Alan, we were using fax machines. Alan went, yeah, that's good. That works.
Well, visually it worked, and the character itself felt analogous to Daredevil and Spider-Man, and maybe a little bit of Captain America, maybe. I don't know, but
that was it. They all were sort of analogs to characters we had loved growing up.
Beautiful work.
And they might even be different characters for us, right? For me, Hypernaut, you know, Alan was thinking Green Lantern, Iron Man. I was thinking Space Ranger. That was my favorite DC space character, Space Ranger from Tales of the Unexpected. And he had his little alien sidekick whose name was Krill. And that was where Queep came from. And with the Hulk, you know, the N-Man was sort of our take on both the Hulk and every monster Jack Kirby ever drew.
Sure.
And we just tried to make sure they looked and felt fresh. Like if they didn't feel like imitations to us, we could fall in love with them and draw them.
I just want to, for a second, Hypernaut. I want to go back to Hypernaut because I'm in a part of a fan group that's producing a fanzine based on the 1963 characters. Okay,
that's because I licensed permission for that. So
that's right. I'm writing Intraman, the Intraman story.
Oh, okay.
So it's a little different.
Yeah.
But Hypernaut, there's been a lot of arguments about, like, all the other characters, you can see their inspiration pretty directly. For me, when I looked at Hypernaut, and I thought, it didn't seem like a Marvel character. It seemed like No Man from the Thunder Agents.
Yeah. It's some No Man. It's some Space Ranger. It's some Green Lantern. You know, Hypernaut was sort of an amalgam of those Silver Age science fiction characters that actually had some kind of conceptual meat to them, right? And you're right. No Man had the whole thing of moving from body to body.
Yeah, that's why.
And he was sort of this abstract character in a way because he had no real attachment to a physical form, even though they were all identical bodies.
Yeah.
And Alan had that conceit of, I mean, the only part of Hypernaut that's actually organically his being is that globe head. And the globe head can move to any one of his many bodies. And part of the fun with Hypernaut is, I mean, I designed like 40 different bodies so that if we had continued, you know, we could have had a lot of fun with Hypernaut because he could move that globe entity, his consciousness, to any one of his surrogate bodies. And it kind of made him like Swamp Thing, right? Where he could grow whatever body he needed.
Well, wait a minute. It's downer time. So if it continued,
Well, there you
What
go,
happened?
baby.
Tell
I'll
us.
tell you what happened. I'll tell you what
Let's
happened.
yeah, and then we can move on.
The beginning of the end. San Diego Comic-Con, 1992. Rick Veitch and I are at San Diego, which is a rare event. I've only ever been to maybe 2 San Diegos, 3 tops in my entire life. Rick Veitch and I are at San Diego Con, and these two, and I do not mean to insult anybody, 2 people we didn't know that were part of the Image team, not one of the key 6 founding members, but they came and found Rick and I at our table, and they pull us aside and they say, we really want to announce 1963 because nothing had been announced yet. I had been involved previously with a number of projects that have been announced and then floundered and collapsed. So my edict when we started work was, let's get 2 or 3 issues done, and then announce it. Like, let's not blow our wad promoting this too early. And Jim Valentino was fine with that. But the closer we got to summer, the more the Image partners wanted to announce it because this meant they had Alan Moore. Right? That's who they wanted. They didn't give a
Which is
shit.
what they were after the whole time.
They didn't give a shit about Rick or I. We were just Jim Valentino cared about us, but nobody else up there gave a shit about Rick or I.
Which sounds great that they loved it, but they're like, and then to sell him out under
I tell you what happened.
The company he despised.
It's
so ridiculous.
Step one of the first brick in the wall, if you will, is while we're there, these 2 guys are trying to convince us to not only let them announce it, but that Jim Lee wants to do the annual. Now, we didn't understand at this point in time that the Image partners were in constant competition with each other, right? Rick and I, we thought they were like us, right? I told you earlier, Tom Yates, Rick Veitch, John Talbot, myself, our classmates, it was all for one and one for all. If one of us got a foot in the door, we did our best to open that door for our buddies. If one or more of us needed help, we pitched in. We thought we were projecting generationally, oh, this is what the Image guys are doing. That's not at all what they were doing. They were in constant pissing contests with each other.
Yeah.
And we did not understand that. And we particularly didn't understand it at that moment. So we were suddenly on the hot seat that minute, like the panel was about to begin and they wanted to announce it. And not only did they want to announce 1963, Jim Lee wanted the annual. And we didn't understand what was going on. So, the time difference between California, San Diego, California, it was not a good time to be calling Alan Moore, but we said, we're not going to, no, we have to talk to Alan. And we got Alan on the phone, and the 3 of us decided, okay, we guess we're okay with this. And Rick and I sort of got corralled and led into this room. Now, we had been doing conventions since 1976 or 77. We got led into this room. I'd never seen anything like it. It was the biggest convention panel room I've ever been in. And it was like, and forgive my metaphor, it was like one of those political rallies, right? It was like the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention that I'd grown up watching occasionally, briefly, on CBS or NBC News as a kid. But it was even more like a Nuremberg rally because you could feel the energy in the room. Like every fan that was in there was like hanging on whatever was being said by Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and Jim Valentino and Mark Silvestri and all the partners that were up front. And Jim Valentino is looking to us and Jim Lee is looking to us. We're being led in the back of the room and it's all being done with hand signals by now. And like Rick and I kind of nod and Jim Valentino announces, and we've got Alan Moore. And the room went nuts. The room went nuts. People were cheering. And Valentino says, and I'm going to be doing a series with Rick Veitch and Steve Bissette. He points to us in the back of the room. And all these faces turn around and look at us like, who are we? Like most of them had no idea who we were, right? We weren't Marvel artists, right? We hadn't done anything for Image. Who were those 2 guys? Look, they're old. And then Jim Lee stands up and says, and I'm doing the annual that it ends with. And that was the beginning of the end, because we never heard from Jim Lee again. We never, Rick and I had a deal set up where the issue he was penciling, Mystery Incorporated, I was editor of that book. It was my job to pull together the letters pages, the ads, right? So the other person was free to work on the pencil.
By the way, not to stop you, but the cherry on a wonderful Sunday.
Yeah. I mean, we really tried to make these books, cover to cover, something.
The ads, the letters, pages, everything. Indicia sometimes had jokes.
And then the Fury. While I'm working the Fury, Rick's pulling together the letters, pages, and everything on the Fury, right? And that's how we kind of tag team. And we stupidly never paid ourselves or gave ourselves a cut for the editorial, because we figured, well, if these books sell well, it'll come out in the wash. But we should have taken care of ourselves, because at the end it became quite critical. I stepped away from what I should have been doing, editing the final issue, number 6. But by then, my marriage had come to an end. I'm trying to keep my family together, and I can't get Alan on the phone. And I couldn't get anybody at Image on the phone. And I just said to Rick and Alan with a fax, I said, I can't do this anymore. I will pencil my part of the annual, but if I can't get people communicating with me, I certainly cannot be responsible for editing. And I knew how to edit. I'd done 10 volumes of Taboo over X number of years. I had edited Gore Shriek for Fantico Enterprises for a couple of years.
Yeah, but you got paid for that stuff.
Well, it wasn't just the pay. It was also the... let's go into brick number 2. As soon as Alan committed to doing 1963 with Rick and I, the Image partners undercut us by hiring Alan to write their books. It was a point of pride, I understand, for Todd McFarlane to get the Alan Moore issue of Spawn out before the first issue of 63. So right from the get-go, we were being undercut. And I can't blame Alan, nor could Rick. I mean, Alan needed income, and the Spawn sales were like 750,000 copies per issue. And, all we cared is that our series got done. Whatever Alan did was Alan's business. But then Rob Liefeld called Alan, and then blah, blah called Alan. And it became harder and harder to get Alan to engage with what we needed to keep on our schedule. And we had great teams. I mean, it wasn't just Rick and I working with Dave Gibbons. We had Don Simpson working with us and doing inks on one of Rick's stories and doing lettering. Tony Tolan was doing the colors. I had the brilliant idea. I was friends with Chester Brown. Chester Brown had been sending John Talbot and I his original mini comic of Yummy Fur back in the Swamp Thing days. And I kind of pitched the idea, well, what if Chester Brown inks the Hypernaut? Because then it'll have this look unlike anything else that's in the book. And Chester was up for it. I mean, we were never close, but I would go to Montreal or go to Toronto, and I would get to go out to dinner with Chester and Mark Asquith and friends that I had up there. And Chester was up for it. And Chester later told me it was the most money he'd ever earned in comics from inking that little Hypernaut story that we did together. I worked with Jim Valentino on the Johnny Beyond, where Jim Valentino did the pencils and I did the inks. But by the time we got to the end of the third issue, it began to get harder to get Alan on the phone or to respond quickly to faxes and so on. And by the time we got up to Tales of Beyond, the N-Man issue, a lot of the letters pages in the first couple issues were Alan. By the end of the run, Rick and I were putting all those letters pages together. We were soliciting letters from friends who were novelists and writers and comic book fans. And we were having to do more and more and more of that filler stuff. Alan would always write the Affable Al soapbox, but it was getting harder and harder and harder to get Alan, because he was taking on more and more work, which was paying him well, which was making life better for him, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I was only told years later that apparently there was some kind of a personal crisis for Alan at that time, which was part of the reason he wasn't responding. But I didn't know that.
That's what I had kind of heard.
Nobody had told me that. I had no way of knowing. All I knew is that by July and August of that year, my marriage ended in September of that year. My family and home life was falling apart, and I'm still responsible for getting this. And we're supposed to have the annual going, and all I ever saw, and I bear correction from Rick Veach, because Rick has a better memory of this than I. I remember 11 pages of script being all I ever saw of the annual. And we never heard from Jim Lee. In fact, Jim Lee announced to the comic press, anyone interested can go back to the issues of Wizard and Hero Illustrated, announced, I'm going on sabbatical from the comic industry. Right when we needed him, right? He steps away. And I remember a conversation, a painful conversation with Larry Martyr on the phone, because I was tearing my hair out going, how are we going to do this? And Larry's metaphor was, you know, you and Rick are the two tugboats, and you're trying to pull all these giant ships into harbor.
Yeah.
You may not be able to do it. And the ships were Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Alan Moore, and we were the lowest guys on the pecking order. In fact, with every issue of 63, the sales had dropped.
Yeah.
Okay. And they had dropped significantly in terms of the first issue sold 100,000 more copies than the second issue, which sold 100,000 copies more than the third. But for us, even by the time we got to number 6, it was still more copies of a comic our work was in than had ever sold.
And let me say this, that while the other stuff that Alan Moore did for Liefeld and McFarlane, I wouldn't call it forgettable, but it was not unforgettable, which is what this book is. Like, this is a book of all that stuff. This is the one people want to see. This is the one people want to see at least reprinted. I have 6 original issues. You can find the copies of these out there.
Oh, yeah, they're out there. There's hundreds of thousands of them out there still.
Especially number 1. But we want to see this reprinted. We want to see this collected, and we want to see
reprint
it
finished. Alan does not want it reprinted. And that's in part because the third brick in the wall, which came after 63, is I was interviewed by the late, great Kim Thompson for the Comics Journal. And when I did that interview, Kim Thompson sent me the manuscript, the raw manuscript of the interview. And I mailed that manuscript to everyone I could think of that I had mentioned or talked about in the interview, with a cover letter saying, I will delete or revise or correct anything I misremembered or got wrong or that you don't want in print. And I sent it to Rick Veach. I sent it to my then ex-wife. I sent it to Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because I talked in that interview about some of the nuts and bolts of the business end of comics, right? The creative life, which I love talking about, is vital, but nobody, well, at that time, rarely did people talk about the business end of things. And the business end of things was reaching critical mass by the mid-90s. In fact, we were about to see the whole direct sale market implode, in part, largely, with what was going on behind the scenes. And I neglected, and it was my oversight, I neglected to send a copy to my good friends, Michael Zulli and Neil Gaiman, because I talked in the interview about what happened with Taboo and why Sweeney Todd, which started in Taboo, had not continued after Taboo. And I forgot to send the manuscript to Neil and Michael. And I still feel bad about that. But I did send the manuscript to Alan, among my other friends. Now, the people who got back to me, which included my ex-wife, who I'm still good friends with, and Rick Veach, and some of the other people that I had sent it to, sent me notes or took the manuscript and hand wrote, and I made all those changes. And then I called Kim Thompson. It was not in print yet. And Kim would make the changes, because this was our agreement that, you know, this was the opportunity that I needed to make sure that before the interview saw print, I did my best not to hurt anybody or misstate anything. Okay. Some people, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, sent it back unopened, saying, whatever you said, I don't want to know. We'll all live with it.
It's cool with me.
Yeah. As with Alan, I heard nothing. And this was after a period of about a year where we had communicated less and less, not out of any falling out that I knew of. But around the time of the interview, I did have a phone conversation with Alan. Alan said something like, oh, I'm paraphrasing. It was something like, oh, I've forgotten how difficult it can be at times to talk to you. And one of the friction points was I had from the start with 63 said we should have a written agreement between us. And I was the one told, no, 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 that's going to complicate things. Besides, just shut up and do the work. So I shut up and I did the work. We got to the end of 63, the annual never coming out. We still didn't have a contract or agreement between us. And now we co-own this property that doesn't have an ending. And that we did not do, and I would always tell my students, when you collaborate, make sure you have a prenuptial agreement, right? Plan as if it's going to go badly. Try to address everything you can think of, because that's business. That's
I will say this from experience. I've had one legal partnership, for a business when I owned a second comic book store, and the one thing that was drilled home to me is in your contract, make sure says what you will do when things go wrong. What happens when you have to part ways? That's the most important thing to be in the contract. And I'll say this: we split, we parted ways, we adhered to the contract. Everybody knew up front what they were getting into, right, and there were no hard feelings. So, I've
had partnerships where there was no paperwork. Rick Veach and I we co-own a body of work, and we both have honored the agreements we made with each other, and we communicate fairly regularly about, okay, now what? And Rick once told me, Steve, you've honored everything regarding that work that Rick and I did together. In other cases, if there wasn't a prenup, we worked it out then. I could still communicate. But in this case, once I got a call from my friend Neil, and Neil said, Steve, you have to call Alan right now. He's really upset. I immediately called Alan, and Alan said about 2 sentences to me, right? I'll keep this short, Steve. Don't call me. Don't write me. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. And he hung up. And that was it. I didn't know what I had said in the manuscript. I didn't know. There was no feedback beyond that. And that was it. And I knew from my first trip to England back in 1984, when Alan had exiled a prior creative partner, and it was something that was explained to us when we got there so that we wouldn't accidentally, cross swords with anybody in this. I knew from prior experience what I've seen happen with other people, that was that. When you're out for good.
Yeah, I read,
and that's it.
From Don Simpson also as well seems to have been ghosted and by Alan, and
that I'm not going to go on about it, because Alan has his own set of ethics. He's a man of great integrity, but there's something I said in that interview that rubbed him the wrong way, and I either talked about something he didn't want aired, or I talked about something that he didn't consider correct. I don't know, but we had never cleared up the legal issue. Now, by 1998, the interview came out, if memory serves, in 96. It was the Tyrant cover of the Comics Journal with my interview. Alan cut me off before that ever saw print. I have since read in a biography of him that he was interviewed for, that he described, being very upset with the printed issue. This all happened before anything had seen print. In fact, I remember calling Kim Thompson, and both Kim and I combing the interview going, what could have possibly upset Alan this much? Because Kim said, Steve, I'll remove whatever you want to remove. And I said, well, the damage is done. I've seen how this goes with other people, and now I'm on that side of the exile fence. But I also want to stress that I remain a steadfast reader of all of Alan's work. I buy the novels, I buy the comics, I buy the CDs. I've still got the records that he had done earlier, the Sinister Ducks and so on. I love Alan's work, but it was hard. It was hard.
His presence looms large over the industry. I'll say that. And I'll also say, I just sent off a pitch to Alan to try and get him on this very show.
Well, don't say my name at all, because it'll
end the
pitch right there. Okay, good.
I didn't. I'm
And
hoping you'll want to.
maybe don't broadcast this show until
Too
after
late,
the fact.
pal. This is
Yeah, okay.
live.
Well, that's your call, not mine. But
You know
yeah,
what?
I don't know. I don't know. I
I'll
can't do
let the
anything
chips
about it.
fall where they may in that sense. I just hope he would want to come on here and talk to me about the industry and the business of comics because, like you
I don't
said,
think
not many
Alan wants
people.
anything to do with comics anymore. But I have to say, and this might be, I talked openly in that interview about the dynamic of the industry regarding writers. Writers need artists if they're not drawing their own comic. And that immediately sets up a working relationship that is fraught with potential peril because all of us, from our employment backgrounds, from our parental upbringing, whatever, will project onto the other party something that may have nothing to do with what's really going on at the time, right? A case in point, I'll pick on myself. There's a reason a woman editor, Karen Berger, got the best work out of me that any editor ever got out of me. That's because Stevie grew up working for his dad. So I have all these tapes that play in my head when I'm in an employee situation, and it's my dad who is the unconscious screen that I'm, in putting myself in conflict with needlessly. And with Karen Berger, none of those tapes worked because Karen was Karen.
Yeah,
she
right.
wasn't my surrogate dad, right? Other cases, Archie Goodwin got my best work on, the story I did for Epic Illustrated because Archie was Archie. Archie was one. I've been fortunate to work with four of the best editors in the business: Joe Kubert, Archie Goodwin, Karen Berger, and Chris Duffy. And those four editors I would work with anytime that I can.
Berger's on my list of people I really, really want to interview.
Karen's wonderful. Karen got, Karen was one of those editors, unlike others, who had no desire to be a writer and no desire to be an artist. She just wanted your best work. And she didn't see you as her pair of hands. She saw you as someone working in the best interest of the project we were all committed to. And she wanted your best work. And Karen had this maturity of judgment. When Alan turned in what was going to be Saga of the Swamp Thing number 29, it was going to be issue number 1 of the Nuke Face papers. And Karen wrote back to Alan. I have Alan's letter, and I'm paraphrasing. Karen basically said, this is a good script. We'll use it down the road. But the pacing was too, I believe her word or Alan's word was funereal. It was too slowly paced. And she asked Alan to come up with something different for that issue. So this put Alan on the hot seat because there was only a couple days left before the deadline. He was ahead of the deadline when he turned in the Nuke Face papers part 1. Now he's behind deadline because Karen says this won't work. And Alan wrote the story that lost us the comics code. He wrote the scariest fucking horror comic story I had ever drawn up to that point in time. And when I got that script, I remember calling Rick Veitch saying, Rick, you got to come over and read this right now, because it was the scariest script I had ever read for any comic in my life. And I couldn't wait to draw it. And Karen was that good an editor. And she was good to her word. We did complete the Nuke Face papers, which was a character John Talbot had created, by the way. And by the time it came into the series, we had established ourselves as a benchmark of how far we were going to go with this comic. And, Karen probably had days she regretted it because she had to deal with all the shitstorm over the comics code. But there was a happy ending. It ended up launching the Virgo line. So.
Okay. So what? So I don't want to dwell on this anymore, on the Alan Moore stuff or the breakup or whatever you want to call it.
Well, whatever. But let's also point out that because of the success of 1963, I finally had enough money in the bank that I could finally do my own project, the comic I had always wanted to do, which since age 4 was a dinosaur comic called Tyrant. I wanted to do a comic that told the life of a dinosaur without anthropomorphizing, without it being a science fiction story. I didn't want time travelers. I didn't want people going to a lost world. I wanted to do a comic about a dinosaur that was going to be like Bambi, the book, the novel Bambi, or Black Beauty, or One of those amazing dog novels I'd grown up with. The Ernest Thomas Seton, the man best known for starting the now infamous Boy Scouts of America, for reasons that have nothing to do with Ernest Thomas Seton. Ernest Thomas Seton wrote and illustrated. He was a wonderful artist, animal artist. He did these books called Wild Animals I Have Known. They were all sort of biographical, fictional portraits of the lives of animals. That's what I wanted to do in a comic. I wanted to put the reader in the mindset of a prehistoric animal and make you live in the Cretaceous era as best I could.
And talk about the pacing and what the overall, like the stated goal of the comic.
The stated goal was to make, again, we can't help but anthropomorphize whatever we draw, right? Whatever I put on paper is a projection of me, my id, my ego. It's all there on the paper when I draw, and the way I draw is quite raw and quite, the energy of my being goes on the paper with my pencils and my inks, pen and ink, brush and ink. So I can't help but anthropomorphize. But my goal was to dramatize the life of an animal without adornment, without, giving him a funny name, even though Tyrant is a funny name, I guess. And that was the goal of Tyrant. How can I present as factual based, steeped in the actual paleontological knowledge we had in the mid 1990s, the life of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and make it as exciting and entertaining a comic as I can. In a way, it's a dragon comic, okay? In a way, it's a work of science fiction. I'm projecting myself into the mind of this long extinct 70 million year gone creature, but I'm doing it with the same attention to detail and attention to the visceral nature of existence that I would if it were a comic book about a white-tailed deer or a wolverine, and I don't mean Marvel's Wolverine, I mean a mammal. Or a trout or what have you.
But right? taking this creature from birth to death, right?
Yeah, that was the goal. I only got through the birth. Sorry, Dan, but
it's okay. So as I remember, and it's been a long time since I read this because these got stolen from me.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. We'll talk about it in a second, how you can fix that problem, Steve.
Okay.
You have the power to fix that.
I can fix that for you, yes.
But as I remember, was it month to month? Like each month was a month later,
when I started, I had a lot of, I had been, we had all been in a years-long conversation with Dave Sim. And I understand Dave Sim is a very loaded name to put out there, but Dave Sim was a friend. And Dave Sim was somebody who, Dave was kinder to me than anybody I ever knew in comics.
Another dream guest. I
don't know why I was one of the recipients of Dave's generosity and time and energy, but I was, and I was fortunate that I was one of those people. And like most people I know in life, Dave's a bit of a hand grenade. There are a lot of aspects of Dave's worldview, perspective, that I do not share. But I am not of a generation that feels like I have to be aligned with every aspect of every person whose work I'm going to read or enjoy or listen to or share or even be friends with. I have plenty of relatives and loved ones who don't. I am the polar opposite of them philosophically, politically, religiously, whatever, spiritually.
Ditto, Steve.
I'm lucky to have that. I'm lucky to be in their circle. And I've learned a lot from those people. I fear that one of the consequences of the kind of intolerance that's become sort of calcified in our culture, and I understand some of the sources of it. I mean, I was teaching for 15 years as this cultural change happened. I fear that it's part of the reason we have such extreme conflict and friction points. But anyway, point being,
you ain't wrong about that. But
Dave had been working on me, I kid you not, Dan, for years. Since 1984, he had been working on me to stop investing my work, my time, my energy, my life in properties that belong to other people or corporations and to start doing my own goddamn comic. And it wasn't until the 1963 experiment. We only got 6 issues out, but we did get 6 issues out. They sold very well. All of us involved did very well financially. Some of us did tremendously well. And I finally had the bankroll I needed for about a 2 to 3 year work period where all I had to do was Tyrant. So my original thought was, yes, I was listening to Dave Sim, get it out every month, just grind that comic out. But as I got into it, I was finally experiencing, I'm a lay person in terms of science, right? I'm not a trained paleontologist. I'm not a biologist. There are cartoonists who are. You know, one of my real heroes in cartooning is Jay Hosler. And Jay Hosler is a professional biologist.
Did he do Clan Apis, right?
Clan Apis. And Jay is a genius cartoonist as well.
Indeed. Right? That's a fantastic book.
So there are scientists who are cartoonists and doing amazing work. I'm not one of them. But doing Tyrant opened the door for me to join the Vertebrate Paleontology Society.
Oh, great.
To reach out to paleontologists and say, where do I get the information I need to tell this story? And I was fortunate in that I already had a friend, Dr. Michael Ryan, and we're still very good friends. I speak to his class every semester. Michael Ryan and I had met at a Canadian comic book convention, I believe. Michael can correct me on that as to where we actually met. We had a number of mutual friends, including Mark Schultz, currently the writer on Prince Valiant.
Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, right?
Xenozoic Tales being Mark's baby. Michael opened the door for me, not just to be able to ask questions of paleontologists, but I got to know some of the people in his circles. And it got to the point that by the time I was doing Tyrant number 3, the hatching issue, the birth issue, I had completely written and drawn the issue. It had taken me 6 months. And I had based it on the available science. In fact, the only papers that Dr. Michael Ryan could send me to work from, to extrapolate from, were papers and books concerning the embryology of birds, the embryology of alligators and crocodiles, the embryology of collared lizards, which I based a lot of my work on. And right when I had about finished the issue, a book came, Michael called me and said, Steve, there's a new book coming out about fossil embryology. It was the first book in the English language on fossil embryology. I bought the book. It's an academically published book. So it was what, $100, whatever the insane price was. I rewrote and redrew almost the entire issue because the new information in there was remarkable. I wasn't too far off the mark. I had worked as best I could from embryology, but I was speculating how bird embryology and reptile embryology would have applied to these creatures that were neither birds nor reptiles. And this new book that at that time it was new in 1994 or 95 changed enough that I went back and I took the extra time, and it was another 4 months before I got the book out. So any dream I had of getting it out, monthly, forget it. I got this really warm letter from Dave Sim at one point. And Dave said, and this was the metaphor he used, that he thought when I started work on my dinosaur comic that it would be smooth sailing. Like I would get in my sailboat and take off across the water. And now he realized, because he had read issue 1 and 2, he said, I get it. You're a deep diver. Like you're exploring the floor of the ocean. And I get why it's taking all this time. You're not wasting time. He says, I couldn't work this way, but I kind of get what's happening with you. And it was true. I had earned enough off 1963. And once I started self-publishing Tyrant, my circulations, Dan, this is the way it worked at that time. Let me break this down without spending too much time on it. There were 12 distributors in the business when I published Taboo. Okay. There was a number of distributors in America. There were 2 major distributors in Canada and 1 smaller distributor in Canada. And there was Titan over in the UK, who also distributed our work into the European market beyond just the UK. By the time I launched Tyrant with the first issue, which would have been in 1994, I had pre-orders. And the way the direct market worked, for your listeners who don't understand what the direct market was, newsstand markets.
These guys know.
Oh, they know? Okay, they know. So with the direct sale market, I would solicit Tyrant #1, and I knew how many issues I'd sold before I printed it. It minimized my risk. So my orders came in, and I'm pulling these initial numbers out of my memory. It was around 12,000 copies, 15,000 tops, which for a self-published comic is pretty good.
That ain't bad.
That's what Dave was selling on Cerebus.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's not bad.
That was really good. So
for black and white.
And the way it worked at that time is your two big checks were Diamond and Capital. Capital distribution, Diamond distribution. Those two checks were absolutely essential, because what it meant is whichever check arrived first, and it was usually Capital because Diamond was a bit more of a bureaucracy to deal with, the Capital check paid my entire printing bill. I was being printed by Preeny Print and Litho, Kim Preeny up in Canada. My whole printing bill was taken care of with my first distributor check. My second distributor check, big one from Diamond usually, all profit. For about 3, almost 4 years, I was able to pay. By this time, I had moved out of the house that my wife and I shared. Our kids spent equal time with us. We were still friends. There was no acrimony. It was just a sad situation. But I was supporting 2 households. I was earning enough that January 1st of each year, I could prepay the entire year's rent for my wife's house and for my house.
Oh, that's nice.
That meant I had a relatively burden-free year to work on Tyrant. This meant I could also travel. I could go to the SVP, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology seminars, which were in different cities each year. I could go to a museum and hold in my hand the fossil of the creature I was going to draw. Okay? I cannot tell you how much like magic this felt to me, Dan. And it meant that when I put each issue of Tyrant to bed and sent it to my printer, it was the best work I could do at that point in time. And I really still feel to this day, I was at my peak as a creator while I was doing Tyrant. I was doing
Steve, it's my favorite Steve Bissette work. When we had a recent poll in the Cartoonist Kayfabe Ringside Seats group about what unfinished work do you most want to see, I suggested Tyrant, but it got more likes than any other suggestion on that thread. And
I hope to get back to it. Here's the problem. I've never again in my life had that kind of financial cushion. I've never again been in the position where I could say, okay, I've got the next 6 months to just work on what I want to work on. And I also did not have a marketplace to sell into, like the direct sale market that we had in 1994 when I started work on Tyrant.
Right.
By the year 1996, when the whole shithouse imploded, we went within a matter of a couple of months, if not, I don't think I'm exaggerating. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, please. But in a very short period of time, we went from having multiple distributors to Diamond. And
guys, go watch my video called The Diamond Age of Comics, where I interviewed Steve Jeppy and we talk about everything that happened. And if I'm not mistaken, you said you worked for a company called Heroes World. Was that the same Heroes World that Marvel purchased and turned into
Heroes World was a New Jersey-based retailer when I was at the Kubert School, and we were doing the work on their catalogs back in 77, 78, 79. That's the same outfit that Marvel, and I still remember, and I'll go back to my friend Larry Marder, creator of Bean World. Larry Marder called that day when Marvel announced it was direct only, you had to buy through Heroes World if you were a retailer. Larry called that Pearl Harbor Day for the direct market. He was right. That was the beginning.
I just find it ironic. They gave you your start, and then they kind of killed the goose at the end. Oh, they didn't, but...
You know, I'll never forget the last Capital City trade show. And I had friends like Paul Pope and Jeff Smith who were, Paul Pope was like the genius new guy on the block, and he was self-publishing these amazing,
Yeah,
innovative comics.
THB and
And on the other hand, Jeff was doing Bone and was successful enough that his wife Vijaya quit her job in order to co-manage Cartoon Books, because Jeff was having a hard time doing what all of us did as self-publishers. You're doing everything, you know.
Right.
A self-publisher who's still self-publishing, whose work I very much enjoy and admire, the creator of Thieves and Kings, Mark Oakley. He calls his company iBox Publishing because it's true. Mark boxes up every order that goes out.
That's funny.
And and that's hard to sustain. And I didn't have a partner, and that's not why I folded up tents on Tyrant. It's because once it was down to one distributor, I had two kids that were teenagers by that point, and I had to make a choice. And my kids
say no
are
more. I got
my kids
that.
Are,
I mean,
my kids are more
that
important
made sense.
than my dinosaur,
But
But
Smotlock points out he would love to see you collect Tyrant, the existing issues published on Amazon on demand, like Rick Veitch.
Rick Veitch is working on me. Rick is working on me. And
dude, those $10 100-page packages, I'll buy that all day long from you.
Well, I don't know if this is the segue, but I have been experimenting with print on demand longer than almost anybody. Back in the early 2000s, my good friend Jean-Marc Lefissier had started a print on demand outfit called Black Coat Press. And I did a couple of books for Black Coat Press. I did a book called Green Mountain Cinema, which nobody here cares about. It was the first book ever written about Vermont cinema. But I also did a book you should care about called Teen Angels and New Mutants. It's a biography of Rick Veitch and an overview, not just of Brat Pack, but of the entirety of 20th century American teen pop culture, and how Rick caricatured and attacked all of that with Brat Pack. What a work of genius Brat Pack is. And that book is still in print. It's called Teen Angels and New Mutants. And it's the only biography out about Rick Veitch. And it was written originally for Rick Veitch. Rick asked me to do a text feature when he was going to do a collected edition of Brat Pack that ended up not happening in the form he was going to do it. And at that point, when Rick pulled the plug on that plan, he cut me loose and said, Steve, I'll still pay you what we agreed, but why don't you finish this book? And it turned into almost a 300-page book about Rick Veitch. And again, Teen Angels and New Mutants. Now, up to the present day, I now work with a couple of book designers. These are two new sketchbooks. They are available through Amazon, and to the retailers out there like you, your circle, Dan, I apologize that it's Amazon, but I'm starting with what I can work with. And these two books are each over 100 pages, and they're nothing but Bissette artwork. Nothing but
stuff.
And
I've got them on order right now.
Okay, the book designer is Mark Mastel, a very good friend of mine who's also a graphic novelist. He did Swords of Sharpay with writer Tom Snagowski, who I'm also longtime friends with. Mark designed these books, and Rick Veitch and Mark are working on me for the Tyrant Collected. Now, the reason I bring these up is we put these out in not one, not two, but three different editions. There's black and white editions, which are about $14.95 retail. There's color editions, which are black and white in color, because some of the drawings in this book are color, and some of the drawings are black and white. And that one retails about $21, $22. And we did a hardcover of Thoughtful Creatures, which is the most expensive because of the cost of hardcover print on demand. Comes in about $30, I think, 30 or 31.
Right.
I am not pricing them out of greed. It's exactly the same distributor split that we used to have with Diamond and Capital. I set the cover price. I get 40% of cover, and that's what I make my living off of, or my earning off of. And 60% is Amazon's. And part of why it's 60% is they do sell to retailers, but a lot of retailers, for reasons I completely understand, don't deal with Amazon.
Yeah. I've
This
tried to talk some sense into those people, and also to crowdfunders to offer retailer level tiers, offer bulk discounts for retailers.
It's just hard to coordinate. I could do it, but
Is.
then I would be shipping
Yeah.
from here. And
Totally.
I turned 67 in March. I don't want to pack another fucking box of books in my
get
life,
it.
Dan. Wouldn't you rather I be in my drawing studio drawing, right?
Absolutely, I would.
So,
okay, but our fans out there want to do other stuff with you.
Okay. Well, like mushrooms. Okay, Dan Moeller.
Dan's a cartoonist. He's a cartoonist and
back in the day. As a matter of fact, when I was living in Grafton, Vermont, which is where I moved when Rick Beach and I were working on 1941, the illustrated story, my landlord was a farmer. And one morning I woke up and I went out for a walk, and what's growing off some of the cow pies right behind the brick schoolhouse I was living in, but some psilocybin mushrooms.
Nice.
And I got the trip off of those fresh mushrooms. I probably shouldn't say that here in a public venue, but that was back in 1979. I'm sure the statutes of limitations have run out in terms of any prosecution. So to answer your question, Dan, before we get done, because we've been on for a while, Mark Mastel and I are going to get product out through Ingram as well. And Ingram is the book distributor that retailers, libraries, bookstores do order from. Here are the hurdles, so you understand. Amazon provides everything. Ingram, I have to buy my own barcodes, my own ISBN numbers, and with Amazon, you catch a mistake, a typo, an error, a misprinted page, a part of the digital file you didn't catch, which in print form is a glitch. No charge for the changes with Amazon. With Ingram, there's a setup, and there's a setup cost anytime you change the file. So my plan is to put out books using Amazon, get the files perfect, then do an Ingram edition. There's another issue as well. It's not relevant with a sketchbook, but it will be with Tyrant. To sell to university libraries and libraries, you also need an index. So the Ingram editions will not just be slightly different from Amazon, but I will also be adding an index because I want the library market.
Okay.
Now the index,
that's perfect for this kind of bestiary type.
Well,
scenario,
and it's perfect.
Right?
It's perfect for Tyrant because Tyrant is. There will be a sizable appendix with my references. It's the equivalent of the gizzard that I used to run in the back of every issue of Tyrant, where I would footnote all my sources. Here's what I worked from. Here's blah, blah, blah. So the collected edition of Tyrant, the first stab at it will be an archival edition of just the existing work. And I will be trying to do it with Amazon and with Ingram. I also have another pipe dream, which is to also release. I did completely workshop. Paul Karasic's going to bitch slap me for this. Like 6 years ago, five or 6 years ago, I took the great Paul Karasic's summer workshop in graphic novel at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And Paul workshopped not one, but two Tyrant complete self-standing stories with me. Then I took that material before the pandemic and went up and spent about 3 days in Ottawa with my good friend, Dr. Michael Ryan. And Michael Ryan workshopped the narrative story. The two stories are very different. One's a poem and one's a narrative piece. And Michael workshopped the narrative piece with me in terms of the science and the paleontology aspect of it. And those will be the first new works I do. Michael was so impressed with the narrative piece, the non-poetry piece, that he said, this is what you should lead with, Steve. Like, put this new work out, because he really does.
I mean, it's comics.
It's comics. They're both comics. But my plan is to do them both as a comic self-standing edition of the new work and a storybook format in which I've asked Michael, I'll pay Michael to do some interstitial pieces on the science of aspects of the Cretaceous era and make it like an all ages friendly kids book.
Yes,
The reason
Steve.
is
Yes, now
there,
you're talking.
there are scatological elements in the not all ages version that are integral to Tyrant, but it's easy to clean up the shit
Yeah.
and the piss and make it, kid friendly for the
Oh
people
man,
that flinch at that stuff. But
I'm
that's
gonna
down the road.
agree.
I don't know when. I'm now retired. I do draw Social Security. It's not enough for all my needs. And I have one big project I've committed to that's collaborative in nature. We do have a publisher. It is a book publisher. It's not a comic book publisher. And that is a project I can't announce yet because we're still finishing up with the contracts and everything. But it is a project where I will be able to work with Mark Mastel to get an archival collection of Tyrant 1 through 4.
Yeah.
And what
All
I'll
right.
probably do, just so everybody knows on the record, I'll probably do Tyrant 1 through 3 first, so it ends with the hatching.
Makes sense.
Because if I end with Tyrant 4, you all know who read Tyrant, where I left somebody hanging at the end of Tyrant 4, and that would not make for a satisfying book read.
Okay.
It would just create another generation of people hanging on a tongue.
Okay, well, Rick, I almost called you Rick. I got through the whole interview and didn't call you Rick.
You
I
did
know.
Great.
So, Steve, that's exciting to hear. We want to see that stuff. When you're ready to announce the new project, do you think you'd be willing to come back here and talk
in a
about it with
heartbeat.
me?
Yeah, I'm happy to. In fact, when we announce the new project, if you're up for it, we should get me and either one or both of the collaborators on board, because I'm really excited about it'll be my big project for the next 2 to 3 years. But during that time, I'm not stopping the print on demand. I've already got another issue of Cryptid Cinema that's being designed right now, the second volume in Cryptid Cinema. And I noticed you had that cover up a little earlier for a nanosecond.
I did.
And I'm also going to be doing more sketchbooks with my buddy Mark Mastel, editing and designing. Cryptid Cinema is I realize there's a movie genre that nobody writes about as a movie genre, which are movies about unknown creatures that are supposedly real.
Yeah.
Now, this means Bigfoot movies, Loch Ness Monster, lake monsters, sea monsters, but it also means movies about creatures that in the narrative of the film are supposed to be real. So King Kong is a cryptid film. Creature from the Black Lagoon is a cryptid film.
Okay.
And I'm a storyteller. So my interest isn't just, Monster Boy fanboy, even though I am a monster fanboy. It's that I'm fascinated by how stories are told and how certain narrative templates become like codified in our culture. And cryptid cinema, I identify as a genre in and of itself, or a subgenre, if you will, because there's certain beats that every cryptid movie, it's almost like they have to hit those beats. And it's one of those storytelling forms in our culture that seems to have been unconsciously absorbed. It's like nobody's making anybody hit those beats.
Right.
But it's like, to tell that kind of story, there's something innate in us that says, oh, I have to have this, I have to have this.
Okay.
And that's what Cryptid Cinema is about. So
great. Okay, well, I want to tell everybody, go check it out. Steve, I got to get out of here. One, I got to pee real bad.
Yeah, bio break. My least favorite word of the year 2022 so far.
Man.
So.
Yeah,
well, I'm here for you anytime, Dan. We didn't get to Stacks and Stocks stuff, but that's good. It was a great time with you. My best to everybody out there. I understand this is archived and recorded.
Oh, absolutely. I'll send you links you can send out to other people.
Great.
And if you've got any other leads, if you could help me get a line on maybe a Karen Berger or somebody like that to just ask if they'd be willing to be on the show.
I was teaching for 15 years, so I've been out of the industry circuit for a long time. There are people I can lead you to, but they're the people that I connected with or stayed connected with through. Sure. I mean, I'm an academic now, right? Even though I don't have a PhD, I am an academic in comics circles. So I could definitely steer you to some great folks. It just won't be the celebrities that you're hoping for. So,
well, like I said, Karen Berger is one that I would just love. I don't know if she's a
I haven't seen Karen since Joe Kubert's funeral, and Karen Berger, God bless her, was so amazing at Joe's funeral that she actually got Rick Veach, Rick's wife Cindy, myself, Paul Levitz, and Karen all to sit down and have lunch together. That's like mind-blowingly history-making, and only Karen could have gotten that group of people together. And of course, sadly, only Joe's passing is the kind of event that would have gotten us all together in the same place. Life goes on.
Well, thank you for making the time to come here
pleasure.
today. We hope you'll come back again. I got to play some closing credits and just a little bit of gabbing.
Bye-bye.
We'll talk to you soon, Steve. Thanks again.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Be good to each other.
Oh, man. Was that a great interview? Epic. 2 hours and 44 minutes. We got 24 people still watching. That number grew and grew and grew over the course of this interview. That doesn't always happen. Wasn't he a great interview? I knew he would be, all right? Such great work, such great collaborations, but his own stuff is at the highest level of stuff that I've always loved and recommended. If you're like me, I hope you're not too much like me, but if you're somewhat like me, you want to see more Tyrant, and you want to reread the old stuff too, because somebody ripped off your old back issues a long time ago. Anyway, thank you for checking us out today. If you haven't already, please consider hitting subscribe. Go to YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you like this, click thumbs up. If you didn't like it, hey, click thumbs down. Just leave a comment. Tell me what you didn't like about this thing, okay? I got to play the closing credits and get out of here. Remember, we've got a closing cameo. Like any good comic book movie, we got a hidden cameo at the end of the credits, so make sure you stick around for that. Coming up next week on Wednesday, not Thursday, even though today's Friday, we usually do Thursdays. Who do we got? Jim Rugg. That's going to be fantastic. Followed sometime in February by this dude, Paul Levitz. That's going to be fantastic too. And so come back. Check us out. Oh, if you've got comics, make sure that you send them into the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. You can see your comics on the $1 Million Comics Cam. I know that's exciting. It's got to be to somebody. So come back and see us again. When? When will you come back and see us again? That's the question. And you already know the answer to that question. The answer is next time.
After 50 years, I gotta confess, I'm a failure. I told you people eat lots of spinach and put iron in your muscles. Oh, but did you listen? Not at breakfast. Okay, here's new iron fortified Start, instant orange flavor breakfast drink. Start has more iron than spinach and a frosty orange flavor. Start for breakfast packs iron. Tastes orange. Start. Iron for your body. Oh, now in a breakfast.